When you think of dinosaurs, you probably think of the T-Rex that shakes the ground, or the Velociraptor that opens doors, the long-necked giants wading through shallow lakes. Those images have been building up for 150 years or so through museums, textbooks, and blockbuster movies. But unfortunately, most of it is wrong. Not slightly off, not outdated at the edges, wrong in ways that require us to reimagine what our minds conjure up when we hear the word dinosaur. Over the next 2.5 hours, we're going to take that image apart. We're going to start with one animal, a predator larger than a T-Rex, which scientists have been arguing about for more than a century.
Spinosaurus is the holy grail of dinosaur paleontology. This was a dinosaur like no other. Giant, largely aquatic, hunting, car-sized fish with a strange, slender, elongate lower jaw and a series of ridiculously long spines forming an incredible sail on the back of this animal. It was first described in 1915 from just a few pieces, but tragedy struck. And in World War II, the partial skeleton of Spinosaurus became a casualty of war. In my mind, there was a very real possibility I would find a new Spinosaurus. I'm going to try. When I first looked at that site, I could see bits of bone everywhere. We found our holy grail.
Dr. Nizar Ibrahim, thanks for having us here at the University of Portsmouth today, in amongst your many companions, including Spinosaurus, of course. We've come here obviously to talk about dinosaurs and other prehistoric creatures and your expeditions in the Sahara. But first of all, can you just introduce yourself a little bit, who you are and what you research?
Yeah, sure. Well, you came to the right place. So my name is Nizar Ibrahim, and I'm a paleontologist and comparative anatomist. And I work on all sorts of prehistoric creatures, but I'm mostly interested in what we call the age of dinosaurs, which is obviously the most interesting chapter in the history of life on Earth.
Maybe you could start by just telling us a little bit about what you think people miss about dinosaurs, because obviously their popular culture is saturated with dinosaurs. We probably think we know them quite well, but maybe you can give us an idea of what people perhaps don't understand about dinosaurs, about other prehistoric creatures, and about paleontology and paleontologists.
Well, I think people know that we live in what some people have described as a golden age of dinosaur discoveries, right? So yes, you can read about dinosaur discoveries almost every week. Somewhere on our planet, new dinosaurs are described. And so one might think that we've kind of figured dinosaurs out, right? We know all of the fundamentally important things about dinosaurs. But I think that nothing could be further from the truth. So yes, we are learning lots of really exciting new things about dinosaurs, but there's so many things we don't know. There's so much left to discover. It's hard to put a number on this, but I think we've probably only uncovered, less than 10% of all the dinosaurs that can be uncovered in the world, right? And we continue to find creatures that completely rewrite the textbooks. One of them is here. This is the skull of Spinosaurus, a giant, largely aquatic dinosaur hunting car-sized fish in ancient river systems, which is very, very different from, T-Rex and other predatory dinosaurs. I think people also don't know that our picture of the age of dinosaurs and really the history of life more generally is heavily biased in many cases. So much of what we know is based on discoveries from places like North America and Europe. And that's what the famous dinosaurs, the really famous dinosaurs, most of them are North American dinosaurs. Things like T-Rex and Triceratops and Stegosaurus. And other parts of the world are severely underrepresented. Places like Africa, which is where this animal comes from, for example. So those are some of the things people don't really know about, dinosaur paleontology, I guess, and paleontology in general. I think another thing people sometimes don't know much about is how important paleontology is to solving some of the biggest questions and challenges we face today. So I think that's one of the reasons why it's important to use the popularity of dinosaurs, for example, to communicate these, really important aspects of paleontology.
And one of your major focuses, one of the things you're best known for, is your expeditions and excavations in Africa and in the Sahara particularly. So can you just give us a sense of why you're focused on Africa, what it's like to work there, and perhaps what you've been finding there?
Sure. Africa is a really interesting part of the world. It's our planet's second largest landmass. But when it comes to our understanding of, the history of life and indeed the age of dinosaurs, Africa is kind of severely lagging behind in terms of numbers of discoveries and museums and research institutions and paleontologists. So in some ways, it's kind of paleontology's forgotten continent, right? And I want to change that. There are different elements to this. I mean, I love the exploration. It's something that I'm happy to admit, like this is part of the appeal. Like, going to the Sahara Desert. I mean, just the word Sahara, it just immediately captures my imagination, And so when I was a kid, I was reading books about expeditions to the Sahara and, or Patagonia or the Gobi Desert. And I was like, one day I'm going to do this, But now, of course, there are other things that are very important to me. One of them is fleshing out the dinosaur story in Africa. So making really exciting discoveries in places like the Sahara. So there's a very good scientific reason to work there because there's so much we don't know about this part of the world.
In the public imagination, the Sahara is kind of just a vast featureless landscape almost. But I think you obviously have to hone in on a particular area. And I think one of the areas that you hone in on is the Chem group. Can you give me an idea of how that was maybe discovered and what's so special about these fossil beds before we get on to what you've actually found there, which is where it gets really exciting?
Yes, one of the central areas of interest for my research team is a place known as the Chem. It's a plateau, a steep escarpment that runs alongside the Moroccan-Algerian border. And it goes on for hundreds of kilometers. And it preserves rocks from the middle of the Cretaceous. These are approximately 100 million years old. And they preserve a very different kind of place. I mean, today the Sahara is, a desert, obviously. Most of it is not actually sandy. Like people often imagine the Sahara as this giant field of rolling sand dunes. But about 80% or so of the Sahara is really rocky, like this big escarpment, for example. The fossils we find there are fossils that were deposited in an ancient river system, which is crazy. It really gives you a sense, an overwhelming sense of what we call deep time, right? So you're in the middle of the Sahara, it's really, really hot, the sun is burning your skin, and then you pick up this giant fish scale, right? Or a piece of a croc skull. And that's when, in your mind, you start fleshing out this picture of a vast river system teeming with life, At some times it looked like a giant delta. In other parts of the geology, you'll see evidence for very wide, massive rivers, many, many different kinds of fish species, turtles, crocs. And then on the margins of this river system would be, dinosaurs. And that's a really stark contrast. It's not like saying, oh, this is like the Mississippi Delta or, the Okavango, whatever it might be. It would have been on a massive scale, essentially stretching all the way from modern-day Morocco to Egypt, across the Sahara. But also, it was what I call a river of giants, because many of the creatures you find in this river system were absolutely enormous. So giant coelacanths, really big lungfish, huge crocs, some of them as long as a school bus. It's a pretty unique place. I haven't really seen any evidence of another place in the history of life on our planet that has this kind of high concentration of giants across so many different animal groups, as well as this really high concentration of predators, right? So, it was one of the deadliest places in the history of our planet. The reason why we picked this particular place is it's a place that is very rich in fossils, on the one hand, but also it's very challenging to work in, which to me meant that, we could potentially find some really interesting things there because other people don't really bother going through all the challenges and so on. And yeah, we uncovered thousands of incredible fossils over the years. Giant limb bones of plant-eating dinosaurs, remains of predatory dinosaurs, flying reptiles, pterosaurs, a pretty incredible prehistoric menagerie, essentially.
I'm eager to hear more about Spinosaurus.
Sure.
Particularly the discovery of Spinosaurus and the backstory, I guess, in terms of what we understand about this giant predator and what other fossils we had and what became of them, and then what this new fossil that you found tells us that is new and surprising.
Spinosaurus is a dinosaur with a very special place in my heart, obviously. It's my baby, you know, it's a big baby, but it's an absolutely incredible creature. Spinosaurus is, you know, essentially the holy grail of dinosaur paleontology. We just had like a brief glimpse of this creature when it was first described in 1915 by a pioneering German paleontologist, Ernst Stromer. And he described a really bizarre dinosaur known from just a few pieces. He did not have a skeleton that was anywhere near complete, but he did have a strange, slender, elongate lower jaw, a little bit like the lower jaw of a croc. Mm-hmm. And he had a series of vertebrae with incredibly, ridiculously long spines, mm-hmm. forming an incredible sail on the back of this animal. So this was like a dinosaur like no other, and he suspected even at the time that it may have been as large or even larger than T-Rex, which had only recently been described from North America. And so we have this incredible Saharan dinosaur. The bones were found in the Sahara in Egypt. They're shipped to Munich in southern Germany, where Ernst Stromer was working, and they're put on display in the Bavarian State Collection Museum, which at the time was one of the most incredible natural history museums in the world. But tragedy struck, and in World War II, the partial skeleton of Spinosaurus became a casualty of war. Stromer had lobbied the director of the museum for years to kind of move the bones to a safe location outside of Munich, but the director of the museum, who was an ardent Nazi supporter, refused. Stromer was the exact opposite. He was a vocal critic of the regime, but you know, he managed, with the help of some colleagues, to rescue some smaller fossils. They would take these out of the museum in their long coats, like little fish bones and what have you. But the big dinosaur fossils remained in the museum and they were destroyed. That was one of the big tragic stories of paleontology. Mm.
And that was the only...
There was the only one...
It was an incomplete skeleton, right? And it was the only one, and it was destroyed.
It was destroyed. There are a few other bits of a second individual, but they were also destroyed. So everything was destroyed, reduced to rubble. It was like a second extinction.
This is an enigmatic creature then, you know. We have a sort of some sense of what it might have looked like, but never a real grasp.
It's a super enigmatic creature, and it just had this strange presence in dinosaur books. You know, they're like reconstructions of this animal, and it looked like a generalized predatory dinosaur with a big sail stuck on its back, you know. And people have tried to find a new Spinosaurus for decades, right? And I became fascinated with this story from a very early age. And of course, growing up in Germany, I read all about Stromer's early discoveries and tragic life story, losing his Spinosaurus skeleton, losing 2 of his 3 sons in the war. Very dramatic background story. And I decided that I would follow in Stromer's footsteps, and perhaps naively thought that I would find a new Spinosaurus, right? And that was an interesting experience, because as a young student and then graduate student, there were certainly plenty of people telling me that this would be impossible. They said, like, people have tried to find a new Spinosaurus, it's not going to work. Don't bother going to the Sahara. But in my mind, there was a very real possibility I would find a new Spinosaurus. And so I said, I'm going to try. And a coincidence, I bumped into a local fossil hunter in Morocco who had found a few bones in a new site. And these were mysterious looking bones. And I decided to bring these bones to a university collection in Casablanca in Morocco. And I thought maybe one day I'll be able to figure out what these are. And that was really the beginning of the Spinosaurus story, because subsequently I was on a museum visit to Italy to look at some fossils. And my colleagues there told me about a partial skeleton in the basement of their museum, and they said that I absolutely need to look at this because it might be a partial skeleton of Spinosaurus. And I looked at the bones, and they looked absolutely incredible. The problem was that my Italian colleagues did not know anything about the geographical origin of the fossils, and didn't have any contextual information, and we couldn't be sure that they all belonged to one animal. So that was a really big problem. But looking at the bones, I saw some telltale signs that were identical to the bones that I had seen in Morocco. And I started piecing together this picture in my mind. I thought, like, if these bones actually come maybe from the same skeleton and from the same place, and if they belong to Spinosaurus, then maybe I can figure out where the site is located. And so I remember the local fossil hunter who had shown me the bones. Problem was I didn't have any of his contact details. I didn't have like his name or address or phone number or anything. And my colleagues in Morocco thought that I was absolutely bonkers trying to, retrace our steps, try to find this guy, in the hope that he would take us to the dig site where he found those bones.
This guy's not an academic. This guy is a fossil hunter.
He's a fossil hunter.
And he's looking to sell them on. Is that okay?
Yes.
So where do you meet your fossil hunters when you're in these places?
You never know. Sometimes they just turn up, they just materialize.
Right.
Not in bars. It's not like the Star Wars cantina scene, you have like all the bounty hunters meet and so. No, it's like, you just kind of, sometimes in the middle of nowhere, sometimes in small desert towns, sometimes.
What, they approach you?
Sometimes you find
Why, because
them.
you look like a paleontologist.
I do. I look like someone like, word spreads pretty quickly that there's a crazy guy who's looking for bones and he's asking people up with bones.
I see. Okay.
And sometimes you just ask like local goat herders about, if they've found any interesting looking bones or something.
Okay.
But anyway, I returned to the Sahara. I wanted to relocate this man. It was really like looking for a needle in a very, very big haystack. It was a crazy idea. Like just to give you an idea, it has been estimated that there are about 50,000, maybe more, fossil hunters operating in this part of Morocco. So you do the math, right?
Yeah.
And I tried to find him, talked to lots of people, and I was utterly convinced at first that we would find him, which is kind of a little, I don't know what that says about my psychology, but I was convinced that we would find him. And then on the very last day of our search, that was the first time a tiny little bit of doubt crept into my mind. I thought, maybe this is not going to work. Maybe I'm not going to find the guy, and we'll never find out, what the story is with these bones. But on that last day, I was sitting in a cafe in an oasis town, and a figure walked past our table. And I recognized one key detail I remembered about this man, and it was that he had a mustache. And I did recognize him, and I was like, this is the guy I'm looking for. And it felt so surreal. It took me a moment to kind of get up and catch up with him. But it was the man I had been looking for. He recognized me, and he told me that, he had shown me a few bones, the very first bones he found at this site. He said he returned to the site and found many more bones. And he told me that those ended up on the commercial market and ended up with an Italian fossil collector. And that's how they ended up in this Italian museum. After I told him that I'm very interested in this site, he told me that, as far as he was concerned, he was done with the site. He said it's very, very hard work getting bones out of that place. He wasn't too keen to share the location at first, but I convinced him. I said, it's really important for me. And I also want to make sure that these fossils are displayed here in Morocco. And so eventually he showed me. And that was really the key moment, because when I first, looked at that site, I could see bits of bone everywhere. And we've been working there for several years now. And the most interesting parts of the skeleton were still in the ground.
Right.
It is now the most complete predatory dinosaur known from mainland Africa, so from the Cretaceous, excluding Madagascar. And it continues to reveal incredible things about this animal. And so we found our holy grail. And piecing this dinosaur together was just so incredible, because it really served as a reminder to us, and I guess to paleontology in general, that there are a lot of things we don't know about dinosaurs. We have this narrow-snouted dinosaur with a croc-like skull, giant sail on its back, relatively short hind limbs, and a paddle-shaped tail, which was probably the most exciting discovery we made the cover of Nature. And when we pieced all of these things together, we realized that this was a dinosaur that was really at home in the water. It had all of these adaptations for catching prey in the water, which was really incredible. In that sense, it really opens a whole new window of opportunities for dinosaurs, because we thought that they never entered the aquatic world, really. We thought that they were very much based on land. So essentially what this creature does is challenge decade-old dogma.
Right.
And it all started with this, crazy idea of finding a new Spinosaurus.
Sure. Amazing story. What is it about African fossils, African fossil beds, that is special and unique for you as a paleontologist as compared to those in North America or those in Europe or elsewhere in the world?
If we look at the position of the continental land masses over time, of course, we know that during the reign of the dinosaurs, they start drifting apart. And so we see differences in terms of the kinds of animals we see on different land masses, as you would expect, right? So in Africa, we see faunal compositions and animals that we might not see in North America, for example. African dinosaurs are not simply replicating, what the ones in North America are doing. The other thing that is important to note is that sometimes you're really interested in a particular slice of time, and that particular slice of time might not be well represented in the rocks of North America or Europe, but it happens to be well represented in some part of Africa, So sometimes you get a window into a really important chapter of dinosaur evolution, and so that might be another reason why you might want to go to Africa, for example. And there was another reason why I picked this place, because it really allows you to piece together an entire lost world, an entire ecosystem. So you don't just find the odd dinosaur skeleton here or there, but really all of the contextual information that comes with the dinosaurs, right? So you can really paint a picture of their world.
Is that different to other sites?
It is different to some other sites. Some sites preserve predominantly, large fossils. Others will be sites that preserve like really small fossils. There are all sorts of biases at work in different sites. But this particular region, most of the fossils are isolated pieces. But even with isolated pieces, you can paint a pretty complete picture, right? Just based on the little, the fish scales and the flying reptile teeth and the croc skull fragments and so on. You can start painting a picture.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I was going to ask, well, what is a sort of an analog for it on Earth today?
If you remember that the present is a tiny little slice of time in this grand epic story, the idea that this tiny little slice of time can offer modern day equivalents for all of these extinct ecosystems is ridiculous when you think about it. What are the odds,
Yeah.
And so it is to be expected that many of these ancient ecosystems also have no modern day equivalent. So we might be puzzled and go like, oh, how does this even work? How can you have all these predators? But that's up to us to figure out, right? Just because we don't have a modern day equivalent doesn't mean that this place couldn't exist or couldn't function, And that's when you really feel like a time traveler, like in your mind, you really see this place. You see these giant fish and turtles and crocs and so on.
So can you give me an idea of how easy it was to piece together the lifestyle of this dinosaur from the bones? I guess in one sense, if you have this huge long tail, then it's a bit of a dead giveaway, right? You don't have to read between the lines too much there.
You would think so.
Okay.
But in paleontology, especially when it comes to dinosaurs, there are a lot of opinions out there.
Okay.
It is challenging because there's no creature alive today that really looks like a Spinosaurus, right? That's one of the really cool things about many extinct animals, but it also means it's really challenging to, make your case sometimes. And of course, when we excavated the tail, we looked at it in the context of everything else we're finding, all of these fish fossils, the narrow snout of Spinosaurus, which is perfect to catch slippery prey, closing your jaws rapidly, little water resistance, conical teeth to catch slippery prey. And so the tail was really the kind of propulsive structure this animal would have used to move through the water. But of course, someone might say, yeah, maybe, but I think that Spinosaurus used its tail to play ping pong, And so our job then is to convince people that the most plausible interpretation is that this was a propulsive structure. And so I decided to work with two colleagues in Harvard, George Lauder and Stephanie Pierce, to build a robotic tail model, essentially, of Spinosaurus, to compare the performance of the paddle tail of Spinosaurus to other dinosaur tails, as well as to tails of a newt and a croc and so on.
Okay.
So that we have some quantitative data, And George Lauder, of course, is literally the guy who wrote the book on aquatic locomotion. He's, the Yoda of aquatic locomotion, So I was like, this is the guy I want to work with. We did everything we could to, provide additional evidence, strongly suggesting that this is how the tail was used. But because we're a challenging decade-old dogma, a small but vocal minority of paleontologists maintain that maybe this was still a different kind of creature, maybe like a giant heron or something, that just kind of wades through shallow water to catch things, which inspired a whole genre of paleo art where people would portray Spinosaurus and it never gets deeper than ankle deep.
Right, right.
Of course, that was not hugely convincing, not least because if you think of a heron, those animals that are very light, and have very, very long legs.
Yeah.
Spinosaurus famously has short legs. The feet may even have been webbed. It's not built like a heron at all. Most of the anatomy of Spinosaurus would be completely unnecessary if this was the lifestyle the animal pursued. You wouldn't need this incredible bone density to help you stay underwater. It would be a complete waste, right? You wouldn't need the kind of remarkable paddle tail this animal had. If you look at wading birds, they have very long and thin legs, which is kind of what you want if you're just kind of like carefully wading through the water. What you don't want is a 8, 9, 10 ton animal, you know, with short legs, just kind of like going through the water. And of course, the little Spinosaurus would still have short legs. They would have real difficulty standing in the water.
Yeah.
So I think there are a number of problems there. But as I said, I think it's part of this world of paleontology where, you know, it can sometimes be frustrating that we have, you know, these fossils that are, you know, maybe 100 million years ago, like in this case. It takes time. I think you need some patience before, you know, everybody is fully on board.
And how convinced are people at this stage that it was semi-aquatic? You know, sounds like you built a pretty convincing case. Have you won people over?
Yeah, I mean, I think most of my colleagues in the dinosaur paleontology world find the evidence very compelling. Interestingly, many of the people working on things like ancient whales look at our research and they go like, yeah, obviously, like we completely agree with your, you know, interpretations. But there's still a small and vocal minority of people who kind of like, you know...
And that's the nature of the enterprise, right? Like you are making interpretations of fragmentary evidence.
Yeah, I think one of the things that happens in fields like paleontology is also that, you know, when you do challenge decade-old dogma, it's almost like an automatic reaction. Like when the first feathered dinosaurs were found, you know, there was quite a bit of pushback, you know. Some people said like, no, these dinosaurs were not feathered or they were not covered in fuzzy integument. And eventually that kind of died down. I think with Spinosaurus, it's quite similar. And I think one of the things that I think is really important is that we base everything on the actual fossils, right? Many of the arguments came from people building a speculative digital model or, you know, kind of trying to choose my words carefully. But I think there's sometimes a tendency of doing some armchair paleontology, where essentially you kind of
get away from the bones a bit.
You get away from the bones, or you don't have, you know, you haven't worked on the bones, but you have some ideas. But we decided to do something completely different and look at yet another source of evidence. And we looked at the inside structure of the bones of Spinosaurus. And it turns out that those are very dense. And we published a paper in Nature where we compared essentially the bone density of Spinosaurus to lots and lots of other animals living and extinct. And it turns out that Spinosaurus is, you know, similar to something like a manatee or a penguin, you know, animals that spend a lot of time in water. This bone density is essentially useful for buoyancy control, keeps the animals underwater. And so again, we were able to provide quantitative data.
So the bones are more dense?
Yeah, they're more dense, so you want these heavy bones to kind of help you stay underwater. And we found that essentially clustered with animals that engage in subaqueous foraging, you know, catching things underwater. So this was yet another line of evidence pointing in that direction. And so, you know, we're slowly piecing together a plausible reconstruction and lifestyle of this animal. And we found a few more things recently. I don't want to reveal too much, but let's just say that if anything, you know, they provide even more evidence that this animal really spent a lot of time submerged in water pursuing prey there.
Sure, okay. And I guess if it has this semi-aquatic lifestyle, if it's hunting in these river systems and it's hunting these giant car-sized fish, as you say, what does that mean for its respiratory system? It was just holding its breath?
Yes. We're building the ultimate kind of digital Spinosaurus skeleton at the moment. And one of the things we're hoping to do is look at the performance of the skeleton in water, you know, on land. And ultimately, we can also try and reconstruct some soft tissues and so on. Sure. But yes, I mean, it's not a dolphin. It's not a seal. But it is more aquatic than any other dinosaur, right? And so it's in this interesting place. It's in some ways reminiscent of what you might see in the evolutionary history of whales, you know, where you see like all of these transitional forms that spend more and more time in the water. Where again, you see like hind limbs getting shorter and shorter, for example, you know. it's a really interesting, experiment of sorts in the world of dinosaurs. Although I'm pretty sure that eventually we're going to find other partially or largely aquatic dinosaurs, I'm sure.
Sure. But in terms of how long it would spend down, it would be more like a cormorant or something like that. You'd have to dip in and dip back out fairly quickly.
Yes, although it probably spend very little time on dry land. So it would have to go to the surface to breathe.
Right, but then go back down.
And then go back down, yes.
Okay.
But it is an animal. I mean, it has all of these incredible things written in its bones. What you see here, for example, is the nose opening. And it's pushed way back. It typically would be at the tip of the snout, I mean, there's so many things about the skeleton that, the skull has fish eating written all over it.
Right.
And it's really about putting all of these different lines of evidence together. I think one mistake that people sometimes make is they might look at one particular piece of anatomy, for example, and go like, well, it's not the very best type of tail for aquatic locomotion.
Yeah, it's not
you could
fully
make something better.
optimized.
Yeah, but that's not how evolution works. And really you have to look at the big picture and look at all of the evidence. And then I think it's pretty clear, where the evidence points.
Sure. Okay, so, I mean, you've kind of touched upon it here. You've touched upon comparative anatomy. You've touched upon reconstructions. But can you just sort of more explicitly tell me a bit about how that works in the case of Spinosaurus, but maybe in other cases too, of how you take these bones, these fossils, and you create these reconstructions to figure out what their lifestyle was and to try and at least build a convincing case for your colleagues, and how important a part of paleontology that's become, I guess.
Well, I mean, comparative anatomy was always a really important part of paleontology. Going back to Georges Cuvier in Paris, for example. With animals like Spinosaurus, for example, we'll be looking at different kinds of animals. We'll look at crocs, we'll look at the teeth, for example. But we might be looking at the crested chameleon when we're looking at the big spines on the back. We might be looking at largely aquatic birds when we look at the feet. So you're kind of like trying to understand some of the basic functional morphology, some of the anatomy, but ultimately you're still dealing with something that is like an extraterrestrial, it's like an alien autopsy or something. You're still dealing with a creature that has no modern day equivalent. So it's a really interesting challenge where on the one hand, you use comparative anatomy and it's very important, but at the same time, you have to be careful. You always have to remember that it's not a perfect, equivalent.
You can't necessarily extrapolate from a newt, the way it uses its tail to something, 100 million years ago in a different part of the world.
Yeah, it's quite challenging. Now, of course, we also have digital tools we can use to reconstruct skeletons and understand, the range of motion at different joints. We can estimate the speed of a dinosaur. We can estimate the bite force of a dinosaur. We can use approaches like finite element analysis, which is an engineering technique you can use to look at the performance of cars in a crash, for example.
Okay.
And you can use that approach also to figure out the bite force of a T-Rex, You just use different properties, like the properties of bone in this sense, and you reconstruct the muscles and what have you.
And is that also true of Spinosaurus? Do you know the biting force of Spinosaurus?
Not yet. We found many more parts of the skull of Spinosaurus. So we want to make sure that we have the most accurate skull possible before we go into testing the performance.
So you're still excavating?
Yes, we're still excavating.
Okay.
Like every time I go there, I go like, this is going to be the last expedition, I think, to work on this site. And then we find a gazillion new incredible things.
But it's just this one
It's just this one
specimen.
individual, yes.
It's incredible.
So every single bone we find there is, from this one skeleton.
But I guess it makes sense given the size of these things, right? I mean, how large was this?
This particular Spinosaurus was not fully grown. So we have some isolated pieces that belong to even larger individuals. But the one we have is still a pretty large animal. It's over 11 meters long.
11 meters. Yeah.
But, the really big ones would be somewhere around 15 meters long. But yeah, all of these bones come from this one individual. And that's, with dinosaur finds, you can usually tell if you're dealing with a single skeleton, If you find 3 thigh bones, you kind of know you've got a problem. But, in this case, we know that every single thing comes from this one skeleton. And it's kind of like a really interesting process because, if you dig up a Triceratops or a T-Rex, as you're excavating it, you already know what the finished skeleton is going to look like, you know, because we've got lots and lots of skeletons of T-Rex and Triceratops. But with this one, because it's the only one in existence in the world, everything is a a big surprise, you know? So when we found the tail, for example, we had no idea that the tail had these really long spines forming this paddle-shaped structure. So when we found the first tail bones, we knew that this was a really big deal. That's one of the really fun things, again, about working in the Sahara and working on like entirely new dinosaurs.
But it does beg the question of why haven't we found more of these Spinosauruses?
That is a very good question. There are a number of factors. One of them is that it is very challenging working in this part of the world. There's, you know, sandstorms and snakes and scorpions and bandits, and it's a lot more exciting than anything that Hollywood could possibly come up with, you know. And it's all true, you know. It's not special effects and stuntmen. It's like it's a real sandstorm. This is a real, you know, snake that's you know, just a few centimeters from your hand. But also, in this giant river system, it's quite rare to find skeletons that were preserved as associated remains. So quite often, in this massive river system, a carcass would be carried downstream and would start falling apart. And so you just find a bone here and there. So you find lots of fossils, but most of them are isolated bones. So in one place, you might find bones of a lungfish, a dinosaur, a croc, just isolated bones. And it is, of course, special to just have this one skeleton of this dinosaur in the world. That's pretty special. I mean, to become a fossil, you really need a sequence of very special conditions, you know. It's not something that happens very often, right? So becoming a fossil is a small miracle, really.
So we talked about reconstructions in the sense of reconstructing anatomy and locomotion and lifestyles, but you've also been involved in some reconstructions in a different sense. I'm particularly thinking of the Walking with Dinosaurs series from last year, which obviously is a sort of CGI reconstruction of, you know, the lifestyles of these dinosaurs and your interpretations. Tell me a little bit about what that's like to be involved in, what your role was, and why you think it's so important to be involved in these sort of CGI reconstructions, bringing these animals to life.
Programs like Walking with Dinosaurs play a very important role in science communication in paleontology. They inspire lots and lots of people to pursue careers in science. I mean, generally speaking, you know, dinosaurs have been described as a gateway drug to science, right? Which I think is a good way of putting it. And programs like Walking with Dinosaurs have inspired countless people to pursue science, not just paleontology. I think it's also really important to portray dinosaurs as complex, sophisticated animals. I think there's still this lingering image of dinosaurs as kind of like failures of evolution. You know, it's like, oh, dinosaurs had their chance. Because they're extinct, they are, you know, failures, essentially, which is obviously a very strange way of thinking about extinction. And I think one of my colleagues, Ken Lacovara, once said, it's a bit like saying that Einstein was a failure because he died. You know, I mean, we all die and, you know, all species will go extinct eventually. So I think it's really important to move away from this image of a dinosaur as some kind of failure. And even today, if you call a politician a dinosaur, it's not meant as a compliment, right? It means it's someone that is slow at adapting and is kind of like... And of course, nothing could be further from the truth. Dinosaurs are an incredible success story in nature and evolution. They lived on a planet with moving continents, sea levels rising and falling, temperatures, you know. It's incredible that they remain so dominant for such a long period of time, you know. And of course, we now also know that dinosaurs didn't really go extinct, right? One branch of the dinosaur tree made it through the big extinction event at the end of the Cretaceous, and those are the animals we now call birds. And there are more bird species than mammal species in the world, right? So we're kind of still living in an age of dinosaurs to a certain extent. So I think anything we can do to remind people that dinosaurs are successful animals and that they have living relatives, well, really, birds are dinosaurs, you know, I think is really important. So I think portraying animals as complex creatures with herd behavior, moving in herds, looking after the young, you know, all of those things I think are really, really important. For me, working on programs like Walking with Dinosaurs is also interesting for other reasons. It's not just about the science communication. I think as a scientist, I find it really interesting and challenging because when I write a scientific paper, I describe the bones. And maybe I will comment a little bit on some of the muscles and what have you, and that's about it. But in a show like Walking with Dinosaurs, they force you to think about all sorts of other things. They say like, so we want to see this animal walk from A to B. Can you tell us what that would look like? How fast would it walk? What would it look like when it turns around? What's the range of motion of the forelimbs? How exactly would it grab a fish, you know? And all of a sudden, you're forced to think about all of these very specific biomechanical, anatomical, behavioral questions, you know? How much parental care do you think a Spinosaurus would you know, display? Yeah. And I find that really, really interesting, and it kind of, you know, intellectually, I think it's a wonderful challenge to have, you know. And so what you're doing then is you're helping the storytellers, the filmmakers, to portray the most plausible vision of a prehistoric world on the screen, and that's pretty amazing. Yeah,
I was going to ask about sort of how far you go, because you are having to make interpretations. You are perhaps having to go a little bit further than you certainly would in a scientific paper. So when we see these programs and we see the behaviors, to what extent are they based on, you know, genuine scientific inference, and to what extent do you have to take a little bit of a leap of faith to say, well, it probably would have been like this, and for the purposes of the program, I think this is, you know, plausible, as you said?
Yeah, we can reconstruct many of the most important aspects of a dinosaur's biology. And in many cases, we can reconstruct a lot more things than people realize, right? You know, we can look at the neuroanatomy of a dinosaur, the basic architecture of the brain, you know, and people might find that puzzling. They might say, like, what do you know about the dinosaur brain? It just rots, right, when the animal dies. It's a soft part of the anatomy. But of course, the cavity in the skull where the brain used to sit is still there. And it allows you to reconstruct the actual architecture of the brain. The brain is a very conservative structure in vertebrates, so you know all of the important parts are still there. You know, forebrain, midbrain, hindbrain. You can look at all of the different parts, and you can look at the part of the brain that is important for vision. So we know that a T-Rex had really good vision and an exceptionally good sense of smell, for example. So people might see that in a program and go like, well, they don't really know that T-Rex had a good sense of smell, but actually we do. Okay. So a lot of remarkable things we can piece together. When it comes to color, in most cases, it's a little speculative, but we know that dinosaurs were probably very visual animals. Many of them had spectacular display structures, crests and sails and frills and feathers, of course. We know that many birds are quite colorful. So there are a lot of things we can reconstruct with quite a bit of confidence. When it comes to other things like vocalizations, it's a little more challenging. But what we then do is we often look at something we call the extant phylogenetic bracket, which works as follows. So if you look at a tree, evolutionary tree essentially, dinosaurs sit somewhere between crocs and birds, right? And so if something is present in crocs and birds, chances are it's also present in dinosaurs. Sure. So you can infer all sorts of things, you know, that are present in both groups. I think you come up with a plausible and scientifically grounded reconstruction, and only a small percentage of, you know, pure speculation, you know. But I also think it's kind of irresistible to us to, you know, when you think back to the very first dinosaur discoveries, people just had a handful of bones. Sir Richard Owen, very famous British anatomist, named dinosaurs, right? And pretty much the first thing they decided to do was build life-size reconstructions of these animals in Crystal Palace. You can still see them today. Yeah. They only had a few bones. But they couldn't help it. They wanted to see these animals reconstructed, not in CGI at the time, but you know, as giant models. And I think that's something that's still with us. You know, we want to see them brought back to life.
Of course, and I guess in that sense, paleontology is an act of imagination in some cases, informed imagination, because you want to bring these things to life. And I guess with these programs as well, it's an opportunity to bring to life and bring to a broader audience all of the new stuff we're learning about dinosaurs, so that picture is not sort of petrified. You know, it's not just this static picture of, well, here's what we know about dinosaurs, because that's constantly changing, and it's a great opportunity to get that across to the public.
It is. I mean, this is one of the reasons why it's so amazing to go to a place like Crystal Palace and look at these old reconstructions of dinosaurs, because it's kind of like a reminder that science is always changing, and that's true for all sorts of things, you know. Yeah. I think in that sense, dinosaurs are fantastic because they show people the scientific process. As new evidence comes in, we have to change our reconstructions, our models. Yeah. I think a lot of people were confused by that in the pandemic, for example, right? Like, I think they didn't understand why scientists would sometimes, you know, change their mind on something, or, you know, as more evidence comes in. But that's how science works, you know. Yeah. And dinosaurs are a great example, right? Where we see this change. The nice thing about dinosaur paleontology is that it's this highly multidisciplinary endeavor, because there's the science, you mentioned imagination. There's also art, like paleo art is a whole big field, but it's so much, because there's anatomy, there's the evidence from geology, there's geochemistry, it's all sorts of things. It all comes together, and that's one of the wonderful things I love about paleontology. It's at the intersection of so many different scientific disciplines.
Yeah, and I think it's great that as a man who has been on expeditions in the Sahara, you still love to go to Crystal Palace.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's the fascination is still very much the same. When I go to a natural history museum I haven't visited before, I think my reaction is exactly the same one that 5-year-old Nizar would have displayed. I still think that sense of curiosity and this sense of awe and wonder is still very much the same.
Yeah, of course, and it really comes across in those programs. So finally then, I wonder, going back to where we started about why paleontology matters and the wonder of it, and maybe bringing it back to humans if possible, to what extent can we learn about ourselves and our own anatomy from these extraordinary alien creatures, that lived millions of years ago, that look nothing like us, because we're all vertebrates, right?
Yeah. One of the really fascinating things about paleontology for me is that we can learn things about a really big picture. So looking at extinction events, for example, looking at how global scale changes affect life on our planet. We're talking now about, biodiversity loss, collapsing ecosystems in our oceans, climate change, you name it. And if we want to really understand how these things work, we have to travel back in time. And paleontology is extremely important in that endeavor to understand the really big picture, right? Some people wonder if we are maybe at the beginning of a new mass extinction. And the only reason we even know what a mass extinction is because of paleontology, So it's really important for the really big picture.
Yeah.
But you're absolutely right. It's also really important when we look at something like just a single species, Homo sapiens, right? We look at our own anatomy. And, I used to teach human anatomy in the United States, dissecting human bodies, human cadavers, and essentially training future, dentists and medical professionals and so on. The human body is weird, right? I think safe to say. It doesn't really make all that much sense. I'm sure everybody can think of at least like a couple of anatomical structures where you kind of go like, why, right? But that is until you understand that everything in the human body is really part of a very, very, very long story of evolution. And so you can trace back the origin of all sorts of anatomical structures to ancient ancestors, right? And that is fascinating, You look at things like the evolution of limbs and digits, right? You go from fins to limbs, right? This is something I worked on a few years ago. And that's incredible. We can do that with paleontology. We can look at the evolution from fins to limbs. We can also look at genetic data that helps us understand how these things work. We can identify the candidate genes. We can look at developmental biology, and that's a really interesting thing that paleontology can contribute. We can look at the genes and the developmental data, but if we really want to understand, what do these different creatures actually look like, we have to look at the actual fossils, We can look at the origin of jaws, of a differentiated dentition, We can identify the creatures that first showed differentiated dentition. We can look at the landmark moment when amniotes take over, animals with an amniotic egg, allowing us to do things that, our amphibian relatives were not able to do, and, spend a lot of time on dry land with a very different kind of skin. There's so many things about our biology that we inherited from these distant relatives and ancestors. It's a fascinating story. I mean, the soft tissues I'm using to talk to you right now, you can trace those back to ancient fish, like 400 million years ago or something. And so when I was teaching human anatomy, I would tell students why certain anatomical structures look the way they do, why certain features look so bizarre. And there's so many weird compromises in our anatomy also. I mean, if you look at the human knee, I don't need to tell you, it's terrible design, right? Or back pain, why do I have back pain? All sorts of compromises. that come with bipedal walking, you know? I mean, you know, look at the S-curve of our spine, and it's not hard to see how there's some extraordinary strain on some parts of the axial skeleton. And that means that, you know, 80% or so of people will end up with back pain at some point in their lives, you know? So even from a kind of like modern medical point of view, it's really important to have this deep time perspective. And I find that incredible because, you know, we're carrying all of this ancient anatomy in our bodies, you know, and that's an aspect of paleontology that most people don't think about, you know, they don't think about looking at their hands and going like, wow, this is a key anatomical innovation that can be traced back over millions of years.
Yeah, I guess we tend to see ourselves apart from the natural world somehow to a great extent anyway, but then certainly from these creatures that look nothing like us so many millions of years ago. But I guess the point is that each of our anatomical features has its origins in some of these ancient, extraordinary creatures.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, literally everything in the human body can be traced back to ancient, you know, ancestors. Or put another way, nothing in our anatomy makes sense unless you have a deep time perspective, you know, whether that's, you know, the evolution of our eyes or, you know, muscles.
So who are we blaming our bad backs on then, or what are we blaming our bad backs on?
Well, bipedal walking is a big problem, right? I mean, you kind of look at the way a quadrupedal mammal moves around, and then you try to put it, you know, you try to put a primate or something into this like really strange bipedal posture. And if you want it to remain relatively straight, you know, there's really no other way to do it than having like this S-shaped curve in our spine, which puts a lot of stress, especially on the lower vertebrae, with, you know, pretty devastating consequences for some people.
But that's an example of the evolutionary perspective explaining to some extent.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of, like, some people really do believe that humans are this flawless, perfect creation, and then I just look at something like the human knee, and I think, like, if you're an engineer and you came up with that design, you'd be fired, right? But from an evolutionary perspective, you know, you can't start from scratch. You know, you start from existing structures and you kind of try to make it work, and that's what you get, right?
Sure. When you're out in the Sahara and you're excavating, you're standing over Spinosaurus, is this sort of deep time connection between the anatomies of ourselves and these creatures something that you think about? Or what do you think about when you're excavating?
It depends. If it's late in the day and I'm really hungry, I'm probably thinking about lunch. But no, most of the time I'll be thinking, I mean, my mind is always racing and piecing things together. You know, when you're excavating part of a fish skull or something, in my mind, I can already kind of see this river system, and I try to flesh out the creatures I'm excavating. Sometimes we're also just having fun speculating about, you know, the anatomy of something we're just excavating. But it's a magical moment, and every single time I find a fossil, it is a magical moment, you know, because I think it never gets old, you know. You excavate something, you're the first person, in most cases, you know, to see this after, you know, 100 million years or so, and you do get this incredible sense of deep time, you know. I think it's incredibly humbling, you know, and it really puts things into perspective. And it is so hard to understand these huge expanses of time, you know. 100 million years is almost meaningless. It might as well be eternity, right? I think it's incredible that science allows us to explore these incredible ancient lost worlds and to kind of piece this story together. For me, this is the same kind of sense of awe that, you know, many astronomers describe when they learn about the universe, you know.
Well, yeah, because I guess you are literally reaching out across these vast chasms of time, and when you touch a fossil, when you bring it out of the ground, that's kind of what you're doing, right? And that is inevitably awe-inspiring and magical.
It is, and of course it's the beginning of a process. I mean, if you find something entirely new and you're piecing it together over time, it is essentially an act of creation, you know. You're a creature that did not exist beforehand, at some point in the future exists. It has a name, it was described, and there's a picture that goes with it, you know, like this is what this creature looked like. And that's a very powerful moment, you know. You're bringing back a creature that people didn't know existed. Famous paleontologist Roy Chapman Andrews wrote something in one of his books, and I often quote this line: always there has been an adventure just around the corner, and the world is still full of corners. Right? And I think that's still true today. I mean, there's still so many incredible places to explore. All those young budding paleontologists maybe watching this now on their computer screen can still make incredible discoveries in decades to come.
In that vein, then, where are your next expeditions? What's next for you, and what are you hoping to discover?
Well, we have plans for fieldwork in a number of different places on the African continent, but we also have projects for fieldwork in other parts of the world, places like Romania. I still have a dinosaur I haven't excavated in the United States.
What do you mean there? You've got sort of a stick in the ground somewhere, and you know what?
Pretty much.
Okay.
No, I've got the GPS coordinates.
Okay, fascinating.
It's a big animal, but it's in a place where we'd probably need a helicopter to get the bones out.
Right. Do you have these dotted around the world where you have an idea of where there's some?
Yes.
Wow.
And some of them are in really interesting places, but it's very challenging to excavate them right now. We're also working on some really iconic dinosaurs. We're working on the world's largest Triceratops at the moment. We're working on T-Rex. So it's not just enigmatic dinosaurs like Spinosaurus. We're also working on the ones that everybody knows.
Yeah.
It's an incredible privilege working on all of these different critters.
Fantastic.
The story of Spinosaurus shows that our understanding of an extinct animal can be overturned, not once, but repeatedly as new fossil material surfaces. That's not a failure. That's exactly how science is supposed to work. But if that's true of a species we've known about for over 100 years, one of the most studied predators in the fossil record, what does that mean for the overall picture of dinosaurs that we've inherited? As we're about to find out, the latest science reveals that many of the best known dinosaurs were stranger and more spectacular than we ever imagined.
Dinosaurs were wondrous, wonderful, fascinating animals. We should absolutely get excited that Tyrannosaurs were 50, 60 tons and Triceratops had meter-long horns and Stegosaurus had these enormous plates. But dinosaurs were real living animals, and we should think of them in that context when it comes to a lot of behavioural stuff. The focus tends to be what is the answer, as if there is an answer and these things cannot be multifunctional. That's not how evolution works. We don't have 5, 6, 7 ton terrestrial predators running around now, but they'll fit how we understand biology to work. We can work this stuff out. Let's not focus on the hyperbole of their size and weirdness, but focus on what does that actually mean for them as real functioning organisms in an ecosystem, if a very long gone one.
Dave, thanks so much for inviting us here today. Looking around, you can see straight away what you do. It's dinosaur heaven here. I wonder if you could sort of just start by what got you into this. Why are you so fascinated with dinosaurs? Why do you study them?
Oh wow, that's a pretty big question. I mean, the honest answer is somewhat of an accident in that as a kid I was interested in animals generally, whether that was living or extinct. So I liked mammoths as much as I liked dinosaurs, and I liked lions as much as I liked spiders and fish. And when I was looking for a PhD, pterosaurs came up, and with them dinosaurs, and now 20 years later here we are. But yeah, I was always a zoologist. I always wanted to work and study on animals, and in particular I was interested in behaviour and ecology, and that's where I've been able to take my career.
So behaviour's a big part of what we're going to talk about today, and I thought I would sort of start, of course, go back to Jurassic Park.
Yeah.
Have to, but there's that famous scene in there where you have those velociraptors hunting those kids, and in one of your books about dinosaur behaviour, you say actually there's not necessarily that much evidence for pack hunting in dinosaurs. That this might not be very accurate, this portrayal.
I should preface this by saying I am very happy with the idea that lots of dinosaurs lived in groups and were even social, so a step above living in a group, having social interactions, things like dominance hierarchies, friendships, exchanging favours, cooperative breeding or cooperative hunting even, and things like that. However, I think the evidence we actually have for this in most dinosaurs is extremely thin, to the point that I'm not very convinced with any of it. So of course, one thing to always say whenever we talk about dinosaurs, and did dinosaurs do X? Dinosaurs lived on every continent. They lived in just about every ecosystem. They're around for 160, 170 million years. It would be kind of weird if they didn't do any given behaviour that you would care to mention. Sooner or later, something probably evolved that, and probably quite a few of them evolved that. What actual evidence have we got for cooperative group hunting in theropods, the carnivorous dinosaurs? Basically, I think almost none. So this really first stemmed from a famous set of fossils of Deinonychus, this animal with terrible claw, so a dromaeosaur, a very close relative of Velociraptor, from the US, found with multiple skeletons found in association with a large herbivore called Tyrannosaurus. And that was inferred to be a group of them hunting Tyrannosaurus. And immediately that's like, well, it's kind of weird that they all died together. Lions don't normally keel over when 5 of them have brought down a buffalo.
Yeah.
So it'd be kind of weird if this is actually what caused it. And so that alone immediately starts to question, well, just how strong is the evidence for that? And actually subsequent reanalyses of what may have happened at that specific site has called some of that into question. I still think it's at least plausible, but the problem you've then got is how do you transfer that? Because by the same logic you could say, okay, lions definitively hunt in groups. Great! So that means all the other big cats hunt in groups, right? You know, tigers do, leopards do, jaguars do, and then things like clouded leopard and snow leopard and no, none of them. Absolutely none of them. That's the exception, not the rule. So you've got to be incredibly careful about how even one good example is then used to translate into other close relatives. And the second problem we then have, leaving Deinonychus aside, is, for example, this has been suggested for various tyrannosaurs. There's at least a couple of tyrannosaurs where we found them in groups. We found a group of animals together. Again, does that mean they lived together just because they died together? And even if they did, does it mean they hunted together? So things like the spotted hyena, famous for being highly social animals, lots of hierarchy, cooperative breeding, there's lots of complicated stuff going on. And even through all the Attenborough documentaries that you'll see of them hunting like this, if you actually read the literature, you'll see they mostly hunt on their own. So they live and breed in groups, but they're mostly solitary hunters. So again, just because you found a big pile of tyrannosaurs that died together, if you put all that data together, maybe that does mean that they lived in groups, but that doesn't mean they hunted in groups.
Yes.
That doesn't mean they didn't, but the actual evidence that we have that they did is extremely thin. You're effectively stepping up from this group probably lived together to this group hunted together, and then, as I say, worse, it then tends to become all tyrannosaurs did this. And those 3 steps are all very big, and for me, all of them pretty unconvincing. Again, that doesn't mean they didn't, but I think the evidence that they did is very, very sparse. It's a perfectly reasonable hypothesis, but we need way, way better data than we have.
You also mentioned the modern dinosaurs, the birds. We've got very few birds.
Yeah, so there are very few collaborative predators for birds. There are some. So the caracaras of South America, these wonderful predatory birds, and they mostly hunt in pairs, so a male and female pair operating together, which isn't quite the same as a group, but it is at least requiring cooperation between them. The classic example is the ground hornbills that you get in eastern and southern Africa. And they live in these cooperative breeding family groups, adult pair and last year's offspring, or the last couple of years' offspring. They basically stand in a line and just walk through the grass. And of course, the idea is, if you disturb a lizard or a big cricket or a mouse, you can grab it, but if you don't, you're very likely to chase it when it's running away into your brother or your cousin or your nephew or your mother. That's the kind of cooperation that we do see in birds, and it's quite likely. But even in crocodilians, there are records of crocodiles cooperating, not in the same way that we're talking about here, but caiman, so the South American crocodilians that you get, there are records of them basically lining up on rivers when there are spawning runs for fish. And of course, if they all lined up one after each other, the fish will go round them. But if they all go side to side, every fish basically has to go past a predator, and it's likely, massively increases their chances. So again, there's probably very little coordination there. Once that's happened, those animals are going to go their separate ways. They're not laying elaborate traps or ambushing things in the way that, we think of lions as doing. But there is still at least some cooperation and some social interactions. But again, the step up from that to, do crocodiles hunt in packs? No, but if you go to the right riverbank at the right time of year, you can see hundreds of them together. And again, if some big flood comes down or some massive drought hits, they'd all die together. That doesn't mean they live together, it doesn't mean they hunted together.
So if I put you on a spot and say velociraptors, pack hunters or not?
My guess is probably not. It is actually a relatively rare behaviour. Yeah. Velociraptor is living in a relatively arid environment. There's probably not that many large carnivores around. And yeah, the build of Velociraptor, I think I've got a foot here as well. you know, they are lightly built animals. They are small, and while that doesn't rule out going for larger prey, some small, you know, weasels take rabbits. They're much bigger than rabbits, much bigger than a weasel. But you know, these are small animals with a relatively light and swift bite. There's been some lovely jaw mechanics work showing, as you'd expect for a very long, thin skull with very small teeth, they're very good at very quick bites. That doesn't scream grouping up together to take out something big. That screams, I'm very good at grabbing something small and dispatching it quite quickly.
And then standing back, just the evidence for dinosaurs living in groups more broadly than the herbivores, we've got lots of that, haven't we?
Yeah, so we do have very large numbers of herbivores captured in groups. And that gives much better support, simply because you've got the numbers. If you, again, the problem with things like Tyrannosaurs is there's one record of Tarbosaurus in a group, but there's lots and lots and lots of them found on their own. Now, of course, even if you live in a group, animals don't normally die in groups. They normally die one at a time. Yeah. But of course, what you really want is multiple records of groups being found together, because then that's really starting to tell you something, that they're probably spending a significant amount of time together if we've been able to capture that multiple times. And of course, the herbivores are just so much more common, it's much more likely to happen. And indeed, that is what we see. But again, even some of those records are very classic incidents of supposed groups are often preserved in things like floodwaters, or at the end, or the evidence from the geology suggests it's the end of the drought. And again, you've got a classic modern analogy for this with Masai Mara Serengeti migration of the million wildebeest all coming together, and they all cross the river, and of course loads of them drown, or the crocodiles get them. Well, they're going to be washed downstream and buried. And if you came back 5 million years or 100 million years from now, you could dig up thousands of wildebeest all in one point, and it'd be very easy to conclude wildebeest live in herds of thousands or tens of thousands. And of course they mostly live in groups of 5 or 10 or 15 and occasionally come together, but that's what causes them to get buried. And even then you see in different parts of Africa, wildebeest are much more solitary, or at least they're living in these small groups and don't mass migrate, so there's not the opportunity for that come together. So even if one population of the species is doing that, another population might not be. So again, lots of good evidence of them hanging around in groups. How big those groups were, how long-lasting they were all members of that species doing it? Did that vary with time and space? Does that vary between other closely related species? Almost certainly.
And I understand we've got some sort of beds of bones that are all juvenile, suggesting there might be some groups that were...
Yeah, so that's a really interesting thing, and feeds into some of the work I've done on predatory behaviour and things like that, in that, yeah, if you look at the fossil record of juvenile dinosaurs, they are fundamentally rare. Anything smaller than about half full adult size, which is roughly where what we'd call a sub-adult. So an animal which is usually reproductively mature, but not full size. So human teenager, you're going to get a fair bit bigger, but you're not a child either. About 5% of the fossil record for dinosaurs are what we would call juveniles, not sub-adult and up. Now that makes them incredibly rare, because if you think of the average clutch of dinosaur eggs, it might be 20, 50, some maybe even getting towards 100. Some are probably laying multiple clutches in a year. So you should have dozens of juveniles for every adult, and instead we have dozens of adults for every juvenile. So juveniles are very rare, about 5% of all finds, but if you find a group of dinosaurs, about half of them are of juveniles. So that's telling you that juveniles are getting together in groups when adults aren't. And of course there's an extremely good reason for that, which is to avoid being eaten. We see loads and loads of species where the driver for aggregating, again, not necessarily being social, but aggregating and living in a group, being gregarious, comes down to predation pressure. And being in a group gives you a couple of really good defenses. First of all is what we call the dilution effect. Quite simply, if a predator comes over the hill and there's 10 of you, hopefully there's only a 1 in 10 shot he's going after you, and 9 in 10 it's someone else. Yes. But the really important one perhaps is vigilance. If you're a herbivore, you're spending a lot of time feeding. And if you're a young dinosaur, you often need to eat a lot because you need to grow, and you're not very good at finding food because you're inexperienced. So this is like a double penalty of how long you need to spend foraging. And every time you've got your head in a bush, or in the ground, or digging for a tuber, or picking a nut, or whatever it might be, you're not looking for a predator. Whereas if there's a group of you, as long as someone is looking all the time, then as a whole, you're very likely to spot it. Yeah, it's better if you're the one who sees it coming and you get a slight notice, but if your friend next to you starts and bolts, you've only got a half-second lag before you start acting, hopefully. But more importantly, you weren't looking 1/10 of the time, which you might do normally. Now you can look 100th of the time and have almost the same amount of scanning and vigilance. And actually there's lots and lots of studies on this in living species. We see that solitary species start forming groups when predator density is higher, or that group size increases when predator density is higher. So there are very, very good reasons that juveniles are hanging around in groups, because they're small and vulnerable and they're naive and they don't know what predators they're looking for. Whereas an adult, classic example of Tyrannosaurus and Triceratops, baby Triceratops don't have very big horns at all. They don't have a real frill. So they're pretty vulnerable to a Tyrannosaurus, whereas an adult Triceratops weighs close to that of an adult T-Rex and then has a pair of meter-long horns on its head, which is a pretty big threat and not something that you normally want to go after. And so you can see why that's going to trigger both the predation behaviour favouring juveniles, but also the juvenile behaviour favouring groups.
Yeah, so I wrote about the landscape of fear concept recently, which is very much about that if an animal is sort of scared of a predator, and has to spend time looking for a predator, that's time not eating, and so that fear translates into less eating and higher chance of death. Yeah,
absolutely. It all ties in really quite nicely together with the evidence we then have for predators, both again among living species, but also in the fossil record for theropods, favouring targeting juvenile prey. If you look at the predation record or the feeding record of theropods, outside of them eating small things, so I've described a mammal inside one, there's records of insects and lizards and fish and stuff like this, but when you start getting into the bigger carnivores and seeing what they're eating, and we can because there's the bones physically inside them, or there are healed bite marks on juveniles, so bones which have been bitten but then show evidence of healing, so it survived the encounter, but it tells you an incident happened. And in coprolites we have some fossil feces. All of them are bones of juveniles, I think almost without exception. And so that really does show that the theropods are favouring targeting juvenile prey, which is exactly what you see in modern species as well.
I was trying to think of some modern examples. I think flamingos, you see juveniles sort of flocking together. Are there other ones?
So it's harder to find examples among living systems, but that's because our living systems are dominated by mammals and birds, which often have a very different system of parental care, meaning that juveniles are becoming independent at much larger sizes. But things like iguanas hang around in groups. Green iguanas even can actually be quite social. They'll even have leaders within their nest mates. There's a brilliant study, and I'm forgetting the date of it now, and the author for whom I apologise, but showing with things like crossing a river, one will swim across and check and then come back for the rest of the group. This is the kind of behaviour which I think most people wouldn't realise that lizards are capable of. And so again, there's this classic dinosaurs are just big lizards and they weren't very smart and all the rest. Well, lizards are capable of much more intelligent behaviour than I think a lot of the general public would realise. And so when we think that dinosaurs are probably smarter than that on average, it shows you that actually there's really quite a big capacity for much more complicated behaviours than I think people have given them credit for.
And then the other big sort of movie trope is having these big predatory dinosaurs fighting each other.
Yeah, and the biggest herbivore they can get. My particular favourite bugbear is you'll have your herbivores, and the T-Rex, because it's almost always T-Rex, charges out of the bushes, stops, roars at them, and then chases them. It's like, this thing would, those genes are not being passed on. If part of your hunting strategy is to scare the prey before you try and attack them. But yeah, the actual carnivore-carnivore interactions, we have a bunch of examples of that. It's relatively common in the grand scheme of things. It's particularly common in tyrannosaurs. And so again, you've got that slightly weird thing where it's probably rare in the sense that day to day, two T-Rexes are not constantly facing off and constantly having a fight every single day. But across the species as a whole and across a lifetime, yeah, intraspecific combat, fights between two members of the same species appear to be pretty common.
And you're saying we have evidence for that. What evidence?
So again, lots and lots of injuries, it's in particular on the faces. So it's called craniofacial biting. Some really seminal work on this done by Darren Tankey and Phil Curry in Canada, looking at all of these different bite marks on various faces of, again, started with Tyrannosaurs, but you see it in things like Allosaurus. And they're really quite distinctive because when you're trying to kill something, for a start, we've got a bunch of, we think of predation or failed predation attempts by theropods. We just talked about that a little bit. There's often bites on the tail, which makes sense. It's probably running away. And actually biting the tail is a brilliant way of crippling a dinosaur because they have these enormous leg muscles that go from about halfway down the tail to the back of the thigh. So that is the single biggest source of power for these animals. And of course, you've then got enormous blood vessels and things running through it. So if you want to cripple or kill something pretty quickly, that's a very good way of
okay, so that's different to modern animals that where their tails are not.
Yeah, so it's not really going to work if you're trying to do it on a wildebeest if you're a lion, which is probably at least in part why they go for the throat or go for the nose for suffocation, because you can't access really big blood vessels or single muscle blocks which are driving these animals, whereas theropods probably could. But yeah, so first of all, those bites are not on the face, though they do exist. There was a paper just a couple of weeks ago with what looked like an attempted predation injury on the face of a hadrosaur, one of the duck-billed dinosaurs, which was lovely, from a big tyrannosaur, probably T-Rex. But for the Tyrannosaurs, it's all concentrated around the face. And you see, in some cases, these enormous score marks all across the face. I described one actually with Darren Tankey, where a chunk of the back of the skull was bitten off, and you can see it's healed. The bone has regrown. So these things were pretty tough animals and getting into serious scraps. And there was a lovely study done by Caleb Brown and colleagues 4 or 5 years ago now, surveying as many tyrannosaurs as possible. And they found that, yeah, once you get above juveniles, so the babies or the young animals are probably not fighting that much, but once you're into the adults, my memory is about half of them have injuries on the face. So it's really quite common. And if you look at them, the bigger, older ones have more injury. So they're accumulating this as they get into more and more scraps.
Do we have any idea where is there a sexual divide there? Is there something?
Well, so that's the real temptation to go, well, half of them do and half of them don't, so maybe that's a male-female split. My guess is probably not, partly because you're probably not seeing all of this. So I've just been reading up on crocodiles fighting each other. And actually what they mostly do is bite each other on the tail. They fight head to tail. So of course you don't tend to get many injuries on the head, or you don't tend to see them. There can be a lot of fighting and a lot of injuries, but it's all soft tissue, so you wouldn't see it in the fossil record. In the case of Tyrannosaurs, it could even be a case of survivorship bias, in the sense that we think Tyrannosaurs had pretty strong armoured heads. They actually had really thick keratin and reinforcement. So it's actually probably quite hard to bite them and leave a mark on the bone. So there might be lots of bites going on that were never strong enough to then leave a signal which we can then pick up. So we're seeing the minimal amount, not the maximal amount.
And do you know why they were fighting? Is this territory, do you think?
I mean, there's a bunch of obvious possibilities, and we don't really know. So yes, an obvious one is dominance and territory generally for holding, some kind of breeding zone or even a harem or something like that. There could be all kinds of intraspecific combat over a number of different things. So, you look at various different species and, again, hyenas, females are bigger and tend to do a bit more of that stuff because they're bigger and their dominance position rather than males. You have lots where it's together. Maybe they were cooperative and they're defending their territory against others. Maybe, female lions will fight lions lionesses will fight lions because lions are often predatory or attack offspring if the male isn't around or the male has been defeated. So you can have male-male, male-female and female-female combat depending on what's going on. And so yeah, that could be mating rights, that could be territory, that could be general resources like water during a drought or over a prey carcass. Any or all of these are possible.
And we're talking about predatory dinosaurs, but there's evidence that a lot of the herbivores may have fought. So I think you talk about the ankylosaurs with their heavy armour.
Yeah, so that's been some really cool work done by Victoria Arbour. Ankylosaurs are the big armoured dinosaurs, particularly famous for the club tail and these armoured heads and armoured bodies. And forever and a day, the assumption has been, they're armoured to stop them being predated upon, and then they've developed these club tails to fight off potential predators. But actually, it's looking increasingly like they're fighting each other. Some studies of the armour in particular show that it is particularly good at resisting heavy impacts from solid things. Well, that's not really a bite, and what might have a big heavy thing that's trying to hit you? And of course, you run into these other problems with kind of catch-all hypotheses like that, because the ankylosaurs you can split into two big groups, the kind of ankylosaurs properly, and then the nodosaurs, which have these giant shoulder spikes, but don't really have a big club tail and don't have as much armour and spikes on them. Well, if this is absolutely essential to survive in a world of giant predators, why haven't they got it?
Yes.
They're in the same environments with the same predators, but they don't have it. And the inference is that these have moved into a much more of a shoving contest. And so those shoulder spines are about them interlocking and fighting and pushing, so you don't need so much armour elsewhere. Probably do want a bit. There are still predators and there's other ways of getting injured. Whereas these guys, particularly with the armoured heads, is to save yourself from being crunched by your adversary. Now, that doesn't mean they're not fighting theropods with them, but that's not why they evolved. This is, I think, something that gets very often overlooked with dinosaurs or paleontology generally when it comes to a lot of behavioural stuff and interpreting functional features. The focus tends to be what is the answer, as if there is an answer, and these things cannot be multifunctional. I mean, the example I love giving for this is elephant tusks. We absolutely know they're a visual signal. Females with larger tusks prefer males with larger tusks. Males with larger tusks are more likely to win a fight than males without them, or with smaller tusks. We know they're a straight-up combat feature, males with larger tusks. They do tend to be bigger overall, but a bigger tusk will tend to beat a smaller tusk. But they'll fight off lions with them, and they'll fight off buffalo and hippo that might be a threat with them, and they'll dig with them, and they'll strip the bark off trees with them. And these are all important things for survival. So selection is probably acting on all these different things in various different ways, and there isn't a single true answer. But if we boil down to the very origin of tusks, when they're just sticking out of the face, you can't really dig with that. You probably can't really fight a lion with it. But if you're going up to another elephant and you've got a pair of spikes on the front of your face and he doesn't, you've got a pretty big advantage. Yes. So you can see how their origin and the initial selection for them could well be sexual, or what I like saying socio-sexual, so social signal and a dominant signal, but then also for fighting. But later on it's been co-opted and is doing different things. But if you consider it as it's either sexual or it's functional or digging or behavior, that's not how it works, and that's not how evolution works. Yeah. And I think that's probably trapped us into some false assumptions with things like this, where it's like, well, obviously it's for predator defense, otherwise they wouldn't have the armor, and they don't even consider the other possibilities, despite the fact that, again, buffalo horns and so many other bovids, they'll fight each other with them, but they'll sure as hell put their head down and charge a predator if they'd rather run away. But if you don't have that option.
And I know you've done lots of work on the ceratopsians and their armour and frills. Is that the same thing going on there?
Yeah, probably. Purposes? So this guy here, Protoceratops, this is about as big as they get. And then this is how they start off. So this is a not particularly good, but a little 3D print of a very young one, probably weeks, maybe a couple of months old. And what you can see here is very, very small frill. It's barely a shelf off the back of the head, and it's almost not invisible, but it's certainly not like these guys where it's, pretty much half the size of the skull. And there's this really nice pattern. I did it on Protoceratops because we have by far the best data set for Protoceratops we do for any animal, any dinosaur. Probably most things in the fossil record, actually, to test this kind of thing, which is features that are used for display, and in particular sexual display or the socio-sexual dominance, basically tend to grow fast when these animals hit sexual maturity. And I think we kind of know this intuitively if you think about it, because most of us have probably seen young sheep or young goat or young cattle, and a bullock can be a pretty big cow, and have tiny little stubs for horns, and then you'll come back a couple of years later and in linear size it's not got much bigger, but whoop, the horns are suddenly massive. And that's because, again, when you're young you're trying to grow and survive. Once you hit sexual maturity, reproduction suddenly becomes very important and the focus goes elsewhere. And so there's this really big pattern that we see throughout animals. I did a lovely work on this led by a colleague, Devin O'Brien, looking at growth trajectories of big things, so what we call extreme structures. And what you find again and again and again is that anything that's used like this, dominance and display, or fighting, grows basically very rapidly the bigger you get. But more generic things which just help your life, so chameleons, we have this wonderful graph of chameleons, so chameleon tongue length versus body size, and some of the chameleons have horns, just like a Triceratops. Jackson's chameleon has two big horns and a little one. The tongue basically pretty much matches the body exactly. In fact, the very biggest chameleons have slightly shorter tongues than you'd expect, but the horns are disproportionately bigger. The biggest chameleons have much bigger horns than you'd expect, and the smallest ones much smaller horns than you'd expect. Because this growth is kicking in as they hit sexual maturity, and it's linked to fitness. The biggest, healthiest animals have the most spare energy, basically, to put into growing big horns. So this pattern is almost universal. What do we see in Pterosaurs when we've got everything from near embryo-sized animals, and we do actually now have embryos, though those were found after my work was done, all the way up to these big adults? We had about 80 specimens. That's the growth trajectory. It's slow, 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 until they get to about half adult size, this guy, and then suddenly it gets very, very quick. So exactly what you would predict for it being some kind of socio-sexual dominant signal. This is probably what we see in a whole bunch of other dinosaurs. I can only say probably because, again, our data set is often 2 or 3 or 4 animals, or maybe 5 or 10. It's not really enough to show it statistically. But we have various duck-billed dinosaurs who have this enormous range of crests and elaborate things. And the babies basically don't have a crest, and the adults have these huge ones, and the mid-sized ones have something in between. And again, we have baby ceratopsians. There's a couple of baby triceratops out there, and they look very much like very young protoceratops. They have little nubs over the eyes, they have a little bit of a frill, but if they were just scaled down adults, it's a fraction of the size that you'd expect. So this does appear to be a very common pattern, but it's very hard to show it statistically, which is why we picked the one animal we could test it on.
New Scientist recently did a video about Spinosaurus and how it might be aquatic, and when I was reading your book Spinosaurus Tales, and in that you outline some of the reasons why you think Spinosaurus wasn't really aquatic in the sense of being a swimming dinosaur. So I wonder if you can just sort of tell us about that.
I think the thing to be clear about is I'm certainly not suggesting that Spinosaurus and its relatives were not hanging around water a lot. I think they were. I'm not suggesting they couldn't swim. My co-author on my new book, Mark Whitten, I think he's actually more conservative and thinks maybe they couldn't, but I think they could. I think they're doing quite a lot in and around water. There's just so much evidence for that I think that's largely incontrovertible. And so this discussion of really comes down to, well, just how much were they doing in water? And in particular, just how able were they in water? In particular, were they really good swimmers or not? And that's where I sit very firmly on the, I really don't think they're very good swimmers at all. And there's a couple of pretty good reasons for that. The really basic one is quite simply the sail that they have on their back. This is an enormous and rigid structure, and it's going to generate an enormous amount of drag. It is actually quite difficult to move quickly in water. And one thing we see in common with animals that spend an awful lot of time in water, and particularly if they need to move fast or they need to move long distances, is they become very hydrodynamic. Dolphins, ichthyosaurs, penguins, tuna, the big sharks, all these fast swimming, fast moving or very active long distance travelers, even things like whales, which tend to have pretty blunt heads, are long distance travelers, end up with this very pointy at the end, round in the middle and pointy at the other end. And you either get rid of things like fins and really reduce them if you think of things like dolphins, or they end up really big and flat if you think of things like flippers of penguins or turtles because they're swimming with them. And Spinosaurus really isn't that shape already. And then on top of that, it's got this enormous bony sail on its back. So it is going to have a lot of drag. That is, when it tries to move through the water, lots of water is basically going to be pushed out of the way that it's going to have to move, and that's going to make it very hard for it to move efficiently, whether that's quick or slow but losing less energy, it's going to struggle. And then it's got its arms and legs that stick out as well. Whereas you look at a crocodile, they tuck the arms right in. Their arms are really short and they tuck them in. The legs they tuck right in and their legs are pretty short. Spinosaurus probably has short legs, but they're still pretty big, much bigger than you'd see on a crocodile. Its arms are very big, or at least we've only got a few little bits of Spinosaurus arms, but all the other Spinosaurs have massive arms, so it's a reasonable interpretation. So you've got quite a lot of draggy stuff there, which is going to stop you moving very quickly. And then at the other end, you need power to move you. Well, I wouldn't want to get into a race with a crocodile in water. They're much, much faster than me. But if you look at them, they're actually not very quick. What they're very good at is a brief burst of power. They can flash that tail really quite quickly, which is why you see them coming out of the water. They have a really good lunge on them for a few body lengths, and after that they're not very good. And in fact, there's lots of scientific descriptions, there's lots and lots of work done on crocodile and alligator swimming, and they're described as poor swimmers that are poorly adapted for swimming. Well, the team that really supports swimming in Spinosaurus, they did an analysis of its power output, and it was less than a crocodile. So if you've got an animal with less power than a crocodile, with much more drag than a crocodile, it's hard to argue that it's suddenly a good swimmer when crocodiles aren't. And so that's where I really think you start running into the problem of that it's doing a hell of a lot in water. Again, not ruling it out. Something I loved seeing, what was it? Probably nearly 20 years ago, I was in Japan, and there were lots of cormorants and ducks feeding on this river. And there was a heron, just a Eurasian grey heron, the kind we can probably see on the canal here at Queen Mary just down the road. And it was acting more like a cormorant. It was standing on the side of this ledge and basically plunge diving in a way that I never thought they could or never thought they would. Spinosaurus would be brilliant at something like that. Not necessarily launching itself off a height, but standing chest deep in water, pushing off with back legs, hammer the tail, and really go for something big. I think they'd be probably quite good at that. I would not be surprised if that wasn't part of their behavioural repertoire. But do I think they're pursuing fish through the water? Some of the videos you've seen, again, videos aren't scientific papers, but you know, some of these interpretations that have come out in various documentaries of them, like moving through the water like otters or crocodiles, I don't think they're doing that. They haven't got the power and they've got way too much drag.
I mean, the analogy's been made with things like newts and sort of sailfish, which have...
Yeah, so sailfish collapse their sails when they're moving quickly, so that's a pretty poor thing. They use it for turning corners, but actually it's mostly a display feature, which is what I think is probably going on with Spinosaurus. Newts, interestingly, they're highly sexually dimorphic. So male newts have the big sail on the back and on the tail, but females don't. And of course they're similarly aquatic, so that's not all newts, but the newts that have this. And then of course the one I like bringing up is the basilisk, which is a small lizard, famously called a water basilisk, because they do hang around water a lot, but they're not actually very good swimmers. These are the classic Jesus Christ lizard, because they can run across the surface. But they have a big crest on their head, like Spinosaurus, they have a big sail on their back, like Spinosaurus, and then they have a sail down their tail, like Spinosaurus, and these are all big signalling structures. And again, we have signalling structures in all kinds of other theropods, including a whole bunch of the other Spinosaurs, which are not swimming, or at least have not been interpreted to be swimming. So this does appear to be just an exaggeration of the existing features. And I don't think any of them are particularly swimming adaptations. But that's even just the broad strokes. I wrote a paper with my colleague Tom Holtz a few years ago, and I think we came up with about something like 15 or 16 different points where we thought there were problems aligning a more aquatic lifestyle, trying to be careful with my words, than something more like I've described as some kind of big wader and even, you know, terrestrial mover.
And then in your book, you also mentioned there's one of the sort of Spinosaurus has sort of come from obscurity to become sort of a competitor for the sort of, I guess it's the title of King of the Dinosaurs. Yeah, where do you stand on that?
Well, so it is interesting. I mean, when it was first discovered, it was obviously a huge carnivore, but found in the early 1900s, lost in the Second World War, famously from an Allied bombing raid on Munich, destroyed the original fossils. Various bits had been dug up over the intervening decades. It's not that Spinosaurus was completely unknown, but there was very little of it. And then, yeah, it was basically Jurassic Park 3 in 2000 or 2001, I can't remember which, but around that time, that brought it to an audience that had never seen or heard of this thing before. And of course, famously, it's even bigger than T-Rex, and then the first thing it does, well, crashes a plane and then kills a T-Rex, and then runs through a fence that was presumably designed to contain it, so not very well built. But, you know, this absolute kind of absurdly, you know, next level predator that's even out T-Rex's T-Rex for giant carnivores. That's not what they're like, and that's not really how they're built. But it's also a bit of apples and oranges. It's like, you know, would you rather fight a grizzly bear or a lion? Well, neither, to be honest. I think they're both going to flatten me. Yeah. One might be bigger and heavier, but one's faster and all the rest of it. They're all interesting animals. I do find it a bit weird because I've done quite a lot of work on Tyrannosaurs, including T-Rex, and quite a lot of work on Spinosaurs, including Spinosaurus. And so I inevitably get dragged into this, who is like the ultimate theropod? And it's like, they're just animals. That's why I'm interested in them. I mean, my literal job title is reader in zoology, but I still joke like I'm a zoologist who works on dead things. You know, dinosaurs, you know, they're not mythical animals. Yes, I know that, but it's like they're not more than that either. They are special and unique in lots of ways. Yes, we don't have 5, 6, 7 ton terrestrial predators running around now. We don't have 50+ ton herbivores running around now. Dinosaurs were unique and interesting in lots of ways, but they're animals. Like, they will obey the laws of physics. There are some pretty strong general rules of biology about locomotion and efficiency and diet and how big an area you need to occupy if you're a certain size to get the necessary food, and how you can regulate your body temperature and withstand. Like, the dinosaurs will fit that. Like, they're an extreme end of it, but they'll fit what we know and how we understand biology to work. We can work this stuff out. So I'm far less interested in, was T-Rex or Spinosaurus slightly longer or slightly heavier than the other, because it doesn't tell you anything meaningful about either of them. It just tells you roughly where they sit on this line. And frankly, when you're at this kind of size, moving them up or down a couple of tons really doesn't affect anything very much, actually. So I find it, yeah, not even an irrelevant, sort of like an active distraction. Let's be interested in it because it's a 7-ton bipedal predator, not because it might be 7.1 tons and this one might be 7.05 tons.
So we've been talking about dinosaurs so far. One of my favourite animals, that they aren't dinosaurs, but they were the sort of flying reptiles of the time, the pterosaurs. Yeah. Absolutely fascinating creatures, and I know you've sort of studied them a lot and identified a few species. One aspect that I find particularly fascinating is this idea that these animals were able to hatch out of an egg and go and sort of go off and fly straight away.
They don't get the attention that dinosaurs get, and they don't get the attention they should get, because some of these things were truly incredible. And yeah, this is not an especially new idea. It's definitely been around for a while, the idea that they might be precocial or even hyper-precocial. So yeah, hatching and within days, possibly even hours, were capable of flight. But it's only relatively recently we've had good data that actually supports it. In part because we had basically no pterosaur embryos until 2005. They're incredibly recent discovery. And that actually is one of the reasons, because if you look at things like bats, when they're embryos or shortly after birth, they have very well developed feet, but they don't have very well developed wings, because baby bats need to cling onto mum or cling onto the cave roof, but they're not actually flying. And so the bones of the wings or the arms are not very well ossified. They're very cartilaginous and they don't have a lot of bone in them, and they're actually proportionally quite small. In pterosaurs, they're almost identical to the adult condition, and they're extremely well ossified. So even before these things have hatched, they've got very strong bones with very long, strong wings. And that immediately points to the idea that they might be flying straight out of the egg. And indeed, if we look at even the youngest animals, they have that condition as well. And we also find them often out to sea. So Rhamphorhynchus, this thing gets to about a 2-meter wingspan. famously has a particularly long tail with a little kind of rudder at the end and a very toothy beak full of lots of teeth. That's not a contradiction. They have a beak at the end and teeth behind. But from the southern Germany, so where we get Archaeopteryx, a famous first bird, we've only got about 10 Archaeopteryx now, and its closely related species. We've got about 150 Rhamphorhynchus, so we have a much better sample size. And we have everything from animals, you know, kind of 15, 20 centimetre wingspan, all the way up to 2 metres. So a full like order of magnitude worth of growth. And they're basically isometric. That is, other than eyes tend to be big when you're a young animal and get smaller. Apart from eyes, if you take the very biggest Rhamphorhynchus and like almost literally like take a photo of it and just shrink it down in Photoshop to 1/10 of the size and align it with the smallest one, you would struggle to tell them apart. They are basically identical. And again, that's some fairly strong evidence that they're functionally the same thing and that they're flying in the same way and doing the same thing.
And what does this mean? They didn't have parental care? Were they fending for themselves?
So that's the challenge. So it has been suggested that they don't. So there was a study done by Adina Pronvai and Attila Osi years ago looking at some of the growth rates of pterosaurs. Now, growth rates in pterosaurs are incredibly hard to work out. They're difficult enough in dinosaurs and most fossil reptiles because you can cut the bones and count the rings. That's what we do, literally like tree rings. Problem with pterosaurs is they mostly have hollow bones, which means those rings are constantly disappearing as they grow. And indeed, some of the bones are so thin that you can't really find the rings even if they're there. So it is very, very challenging. But they did get some decent data, and it did suggest that they had very slow growth. Now, that fits with the idea that they are precocial and hyperprecocial, because again, if you need to power a flying animal, flight is weirdly simultaneously, it's really quite an efficient way of getting around, but it also very high energy demand. So if you need to eat lots just to move about and then find more food to move about, you're not putting a lot into growth. So what they were showing is that they were relatively slow growing. And so that would fit with the idea that they're effectively entirely independent foragers from hatching. But on the flip side, there are some animals which are precocial, but also get parental care. I mean, for example, we think of things like antelope. You know, famously, lots of antelope and deer can walk and even run hours after being born. They are pretty independent in a locomotory sense, whilst being reliant on their parents for protection and, of course, mothers for milk. Crocodiles, yes, the adults will feed the babies, but the babies are mostly foraging for themselves and catching tadpoles and insects and tiny fish and stuff like this. But mum and dad, and in particular mum, will protect them. So just moving yourself around and feeding yourself doesn't mean there isn't some form of parental care there. And of course, establishing that becomes very, very difficult. But I wouldn't be at all surprised if there wasn't some combination of the two. And indeed, this is probably normal in dinosaurs. Most dinosaurs are exhibiting some post-hatching parental care, so they're looking after the eggs.
Even the giant sauropods?
So the sauropods are probably the exception. You've unfortunately stumbled across the one where that's probably not happening. But this goes back to a classic bit of behaviour in what we call the extant phylogenetic bracket. In other words, the living groups that evolutionarily bracket our understanding of dinosaurs. And in the one case, that's the crocodilians. The living crocodilians are the nearest non-living dinosaurs that we have, and then birds are literally dinosaurs. If you look at those two groups, all crocodilians have pre and post-hatching parental care. So they look after the eggs and they look after the babies. There's 30-ish species, but that's still all of them. And with birds, there are a handful of birds that have hyperprecocial babies where the parents do not look after them. They hatch and run off and that's the end of it. But they are a real handful. They're their own specialist group. They're very unusual, and it's certainly not the ancestral condition. Yeah. All other birds of our 11-ish thousand species have pre and post-hatching parental care. So as a default hypothesis, it's a reasonable inference. If all your ancestors did it and all your descendants did it, you probably did it. So that's our starting point. And of course, that's true for pterosaurs as well. Pterosaurs are very close relatives of dinosaurs. They would similarly be bracketed by crocodiles and birds. So yeah, that should be your starting hypothesis, and then you need to look for evidence that would really contradict that, or of course ideally evidence that supports that. And in plenty of dinosaurs it does, but the sauropods are one where actually it doesn't look like it. It looks like they're much more turtle-like. They dump the eggs and then the parents move off.
There's talk of having sort of pterosaurs being able to fly from hatching, but also having parental care, is sort of conjuring up this vision of a mother pterosaur flying through the air with a trail of little sort of hatchlings behind it.
I've not thought of it, but it's certainly not impossible. There are some of the Arctic ducks do that, where they hatch and then almost immediately off the cliff and just swim out to sea. And that's very different to flying, but it's effectively the same thing.
And I think some of the pterosaurs had these extraordinary head crests.
In a way that puts many of the dinosaurs to shame. You see some extraordinary, Pteranodon famously with this big long kind of spike out the back, but things like Tapejara, this isn't a great model for much of it, but these enormous extravagant expanses on the heads. It's really very common. More pterosaurs than not have some kind of cranial crest, and indeed we know a whole bunch that had soft tissue crests. And so, of course, we found them under rare cases of exceptional preservation, but it means even there's quite a few which don't apparently have one that may well have done if the preservation was better.
And you sort of looked into what these might have been for? Yeah,
so it goes back to what we're talking about with various other dinosaurs as well. There's good evidence that this is socio-sexual selection. Again, these crests are bigger in older animals, which is what you'd expect. They're not obviously functional, so there's no.
Aren't they actually an impediment in some cases?
So that is a great argument for something like this. Is that it's a dirty great bit of bone stuck on your head, which actually isn't a great thing to do if you're trying to fly. It's been suggested multiple times they actually help them steering, but personally, I don't think any of the papers that have argued that have been very convincing. And even if it's possibly true, I think it's going to be a secondary co-option, because one other thing that you can look at, which we didn't discuss earlier, is variance. So you look at things like deer and antelope, and everything's different. Like, you can tell deer and antelope apart mostly by what their horns or antlers shape is. Each species is unique, and there's not one best way of doing this, which is quite a good argument that they're non-functional, particularly when it comes to mechanics, because there is probably one best way to make a little rudder. If you look at aircraft, there's a reason they pretty much all have exactly the same shape of tailplane, because that's the best way of moving air around. The best way for an aircraft, admittedly, but it's still the same functional point that, there is one good way of making a flipper. There's a reason that turtles and dolphins and penguins have ended up taking the same arm and making the same flipper, and plesiosaurs and plenty of others too as well, of course. Whereas with pterosaurs, all the head crests are different. Every single group, well, if it's some massive selectional pressure to help you steer in the air, we'd expect them to all end up looking the same. Instead, they all end up looking different. And then, as you say, it's potentially a lot of weight. At least some studies. I did one with my PhD student Ross Elgin years ago. We showed it probably didn't help them steer, or at least it didn't help Pteranodon steer. So we don't have a strong mechanical evidence. There's this insane variation, and it's arguably quite a strong penalty. And then we've got the growth trajectory. Again, if you're flying out of the egg and this helps you steer, why haven't the babies got it?
Yes. And now, another thing that pterosaurs are famous for are some of the very huge species that evolved later on. On your podcast, someone asked about this, and you gave a couple of sort of fascinating reasons why pterosaurs might have got bigger than birds in relation to the muscles and the feathers. Yeah, so I'm going to annoy every ornithologist, which is probably a very good number of the people watching this, but birds aren't actually very good at flying compared to pterosaurs. And if you want a bit of a sop, as far as we can tell. And there's a couple of good reasons for this. My go-to analogy is I think the aircraft was called the Yak. This was the Soviet attempt at making a Harrier jump jet. But what they actually did was put two engines in it, one to take off vertically and then one to move it horizontally. The problem is when you're moving horizontally, you're now carrying all the weight of the extra engine. So it's not a very good way of, it does, but it's not a very good way of making an efficient aircraft. Yeah. And this is what birds do, because actually birds jump into the air with their legs, and on the ground they're running around using their legs, so they need big, heavy, strong legs to jump and run around and get into the air. But then when they're flying with their wings, and the legs are now just dead weight. Whereas pterosaurs, although they're quadrupeds on the ground, their hind legs are really, really skinny. They're virtually like splints of bone and crutches, with very little musculature at all. And actually what they're walking and running around with is the enormous flight muscles on the front limbs.
And so when they come to launch, they're jumping and launching with the giant flight muscles which they already needed to fly. So they're not lugging all this extra dead weight around of legs. And the other thing they have is they're not feathered. They did have a filamentous body covering. Depending on quite how the data falls out, this may or may not be effectively an ancestral feather. So people have called them feathers on pterosaurs. I'm not too happy with that until we've established it, but it's at least plausibly the same evolutionary trait, but it's quite different to what we see in birds. But more importantly, they have their, membranous wings, which are very, very thin. So wouldn't have weighed that much. Bird feathers are actually quite heavy, and in particular, bigger birds have heavier feathers. I think its swans are about 20% feather. That is a lot of feather, and it's much more than the smaller birds. So as birds get bigger and bigger, they need more and more feathers to create the airfoil to keep them up. And of course, it's layered, so there's like stacks and stacks of these things. And so they're lugging around all this extra feather weight, and they're lugging around all this extra leg weight, which makes it hard to make a very big bird. But pterosaurs have neither of those problems, which probably explains why we've got 4, if not 5 lineages of pterosaur that got to more than 7-8 meters in wingspan, and they top out at 10. Albatross are 3 and a bit. So 3 times the size, and multiple lineages that beat that. And even if you then go into the fossil record and look for the giant bird like, the teratons and some of the really big ones, you still have multiple pterosaur species which were much bigger than the largest bird species.
I've been asking all the questions so far, but as we finish up, I'd like to give you a chance to sort of talk about things that you think are important when it comes to dinosaur behavior and things like, what messages would you like to people to have?
Oh boy, dinosaurs were real living animals, and we should think of them in that context. They had interactions with each other and their environment and other species, and they're going to obey the kind of very rough laws of nature such as they are, and we understand how biological systems operate, and we need to think of them much more in that context than we do as movie monsters or even in a lot of documentaries. They are real functioning animals. They are superlative animals. We should absolutely get excited that Titanosaurs were 50, 60 tons and Tyrannosaurus was 5, 6 tons or whatever the current estimates put it at, and Triceratops had meter-long horns and Stegosaurus had these enormous plates, and they are wondrous, wonderful, fascinating animals. As are pandas and lions and centipedes and jellyfish and everything else. So let's sit them within that pantheon and treat them as real animals, and not focus on like the hyperbole of their size and weirdness, but focus on what does that actually mean for them as real functioning organisms in an ecosystem, if a very long gone one.
So just looking forward, it's been said we're in a sort of golden age of discovery when it comes to dinosaurs and pterosaurs. Yeah. Do you think, have we still got an enormous amount to learn? Is there lots more that we can find out?
Yeah. I think we've been saying we're in a golden age of X for probably about 50, 60 years, but it's probably been true with just the ever-increasing number of researchers, new fossils, new techniques we can apply to those fossils, and all the rest of it. I'd be tempted to say it's, if anything, about to level off. I think, the higher education sector as a whole is struggling a bit. We're seeing that in the US in particular a bit. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if it curtailed a bit in the near future. But yeah, how much more is there to get? An extraordinary amount. You look at things like, we talk about species accumulation curves, like how rapidly we find things. Of course, what tends to happen is it takes a while to find things and recognize that you've got a new group. It then accelerates rapidly, and then once you've found everything, it kind of tails off. When you found nearly all the species, it's harder and harder to find a new one. If you look at those accumulation curves for pterosaurs and dinosaurs and plenty of other things, it's still just going up. It's shown absolutely no signs of plateauing anywhere. We're still finding not like entirely novel groups in the sense that, we found, sauropods, the ornithischians, the theropods. We found another group. It's not quite like that, but we're absolutely finding new, I hate the term family, it's a taxonomic problem, but like family equivalents that we didn't know existed are still being found. There are entire new groups of animals within dinosaurs, within pterosaurs, that a few years ago we didn't know existed, or we suspected that there's this weird skeleton, but we're not quite sure what it is, but we only got a bit of it. And then you find a whole one and go, oh, it is actually quite different to what we thought, and it has these features we didn't know about, and that now explains those other bits as well. And it really quite changes how you understand things. That is still happening, and that's just the taxonomy. What species do we have, and the systematics, how do they relate to each other? Of course, every new good skeleton can unlock entire new understandings that we didn't know exist. I mean, you look at the first pterosaurs that had the wings preserved. We were pretty confident they had wings and these enormous long arms and were probably flying if we're finding them well out to sea. But once you actually start finding things like that, well, now we can look at the actual shape and structure of it and how compliant it was and what the wing shape was and how it might have flown. And your knowledge just goes up and up and up and up, or at least the opportunities go up.
And is it all still about sort of just going out there and discovering these fossils, or are there sort of technologies and developments like that?
It's always a bit of everything. CT scanning has allowed us to get inside fossils in a way that it didn't. We're now putting stuff in the synchrotron and getting incredible resolution that's much smaller than we ever could before, to look at stuff in microscopic detail and cellular level stuff in these preservations, 3D reconstructions, doing mechanics. People have applied machine learning to looking at isolated teeth, because working them out one at a time by hand takes forever and it's still not that reliable. We're applying technology all over the place, but the raw material of our subject is in the ground. And yes, it's in museums, but there's an awful lot more of it in the ground than there is in museums. And so, we're not going to stop digging anytime soon, and it's going to remain a foundational part of what we do.
Every time new fossil material surfaces, the picture changes, as we've seen with Spinosaurus and many household names from the dinosaur world. I can't help but wonder, if we're still finding out more about species we've known about for over a century, how many are we still missing entirely? Paleontologists are still uncovering new ones all the time. In the next section of this marathon, we'll meet two of the latest additions to the dinosaur pantheon.
This is Enigmacursor Molly Borthwicki. It's just gone on display for the public to see. And it's a small dinosaur. It's as you can see, about 1.5 meters long, two-legged, little forelimbs, big hind limbs. It was probably quite a fast runner. And it lived about 150 million years ago in the Western US. It's a new type of dinosaur. Actually, when it first came to us, it was called Nanosaurus. And Nanosaurus is a dinosaur that was named about 150 years ago from the Western US, from the late Jurassic rocks. When we want to name a new dinosaur or any new specimen, any new species, we have to take the one that we've got and compare it with the holotype. Now, the holotype's the specimen that kind of holds the name. It's like the template. And so we have to take ours and say, well, is this really the same thing or is it something different? So we went to all the museums where there were little fragmentary bits of these sorts of dinosaurs that have been named over the last sort of 100 years, including Nanosaurus. And we took a look at those and we realized that actually none of them were good enough to be recognized as distinct species today. So the first thing we did was we kind of got rid of all of them. We wiped the slate clean, we got rid of Nanosaurus, we set aside all those names and were able to recognise ours, which has a number of very clear distinctive features that make it different from all the closely related dinosaurs. When we think of dinosaurs, we always think of the great big, massive, long neck, long-tailed, four-legged dinosaurs. But actually most dinosaurs, or all dinosaurs, started off as two-legged animals with little forelimbs like this one. And this actually has that kind of, relatively early sort of morphology, this very long legs, these short arms. And this was a herbivore, so it was probably using its forelimbs to, pull vegetation into its mouth. We can tell from its very, very long legs, and as you can see, very big feet, that it was probably quite a fast runner, probably could maybe outrun us, a bit hard to tell, but maybe. It was a herbivore. We can tell this from its teeth, but also just the sorts of dinosaur it is and closely related relatives we know are all herbivorous. We know that it was living on floodplains and alongside river systems at the feet of things like Diplodocus and Stegosaurus 150 million years ago. At that time, of course, flowering plants hadn't evolved, there was no grass, so it would have been eating things like ferns and cycads. There are a number of features on the femur, the upper limb bone, that relate to muscle attachments. These are the big muscles that would have kind of driven locomotion. And they are differently proportioned, differently sized, and differently shaped from some closely related dinosaurs. So they would have had some sort of functional implications for the way the animal moved. We haven't really nailed down exactly what that is, but at this point we're just looking at what the species is, and the shapes of those processes tell us that it was different. Not all of the bones are real in Enigmacursor. came to us already mounted. So one of the things that we first had to do was to sort of figure out what was real and what wasn't. And of course, when it was sold to us, we had information from the people who dug it up about what they'd actually found. But we wanted to check that actually it's so well reconstructed, it was quite difficult. So one of the things we had to do was we actually X-rayed it. Normally we CT scan fossils, but we couldn't CT scan this one because there are actually some magnets embedded in some parts of it, and that would have broken our CT scanner. So we actually we X-rayed it, and that allowed us really clearly to see which bits of the fossil were real and which bits weren't. And what we have actually is the skull is not real. We've only got 3 teeth. That's the only part of the head that we've got. Most of the neck vertebrae are not real, but we have some at the bottom of the neck. The back is mostly real. The tail, about the first maybe third of it is real, and then the end of the tail is not real. But what we do have are virtually complete limbs. And actually that's really fortunate because it's the hind limbs and the hips that really allow us to distinguish this dinosaur from other closely related ones. So the group of rocks that this dinosaur is from is called the Morrison Formation, and these are extremely well-known deposits that you know, where all of your most favourite dinosaurs from when you were 7 lived. So Stegosaurus, Brachiosaurus, Allosaurus, Brontosaurus, Camarasaurus, all of those really famous dinosaurs are from these rocks. There's been a really long history of sort of trophy hunting in the Morrison Formation, so you can imagine that people are very keen to go after the very famous, the impressive dinosaurs, the long neck, long tail ones, or the ones with the big pointy teeth. So, you know, to some extent people have overlooked these little dinosaurs, and of course actually their fossils just don't preserve as well because they're much smaller. So we just need to go back and look really hard and, you know, check what we thought we knew to see whether we can find some more of them. One of the things that we did with this is we put it into an evolutionary tree of these sorts of dinosaurs. And actually this is a very early stage in the evolution of dinosaurs that went on to become things like the duck-billed hadrosaurs or the horned and frilled ceratopsians. And if we want to understand, you know, how that diversity of dinosaurs was established, then we need to go right back to the beginning. And this is, you know, one of the very, very earliest members of that group. So what it allows us to do is start to understand, you know, the very, very early stages in the evolution of a whole diversity of dinosaurs.
I didn't find the tip of the snout. That fell out the cliff.
I just found something quite extraordinary. It's the end of a jaw of the teeth of a massive pliosaur.
We went back again with a drone to see where it had come from. What's behind us is the most complete pliosaur skull discovered probably worldwide.
The fact that it's got its teeth mainly still in the sockets, meshed together in the jaw, it's almost, you know, unheard of. The whole logistics of finding something halfway down a cliff, learning to prusik, which is basically abseiling the wrong way but with a lot of physical effort, rig up a compressor on the top of the cliff with air lines and start to dig a cave into the cliff to expose the rear of the fossil reptile's head. We'd never done a lot of this before. You're learning all the time.
Luckily, on the last day of the project that we had before the climbing firm had to go back, we got it at 9:30, finished it that night.
When we first got it in here and it was still in the crate that it had gone up the cliff in, there was fragments of bone and foam, and there was a mouse's nest in there and a mummified mouse, and it was just like the daunting amount of work. You get to this.
This is the pinnacle really of the things that I've been involved with up to now. All I want from it is more information. The science is the thing that drives me, is what does it show you? What does it tell you? Anything different? There's going to be a lot of people fighting over this and discussing it.
It's a new species, very likely a new species, because it has a few novel features, especially in the way that its sutures are organised, especially around the nasal area and the snout.
These teeth, they got 2 carinas, so sharp cutting edges. Ridges along the 2 faces of the sort of tooth there, supposedly to break the sort of vacuum. More advanced features such as these pits in that at the front of the snout.
But it also has a very unique sagittal crest, which is this light-sensitive third eye, which stretches all the way from the very back of the skull to about a third of the way along, that seems to be particularly well developed. So it's got an extremely large slit for the eye, and the crest is particularly high. The height of the crest might be an indication of differences between the male and female sexes of these pliosaurs. However, we don't really have enough specimens to be able to say that for sure. And the other thing that I'm wondering about is its stage of development. It may be that that pliosaur is still developing and is still in a juvenile stage, or late juvenile, late teenager, you might say. It's a proposal, it's a hypothesis at the moment, I can't be sure. We have fragmentary data from the Kimmeridgian, vertebrae, also paddle bones and so on, that suggest that there were larger pliosaurs around. We just haven't found their skulls yet. And if that is the case, then already at 1.7 meters, this animal is large and would suggest that had it lived, it would have become larger.
This is the top of the food chain. These are described as the largest carnivorous reptiles that ever lived, and certainly they were the mega predator of the Jurassic seas.
Once upon a time, these creatures broke away from the line of plesiosaurs, the long-necked, small-headed marine reptiles, and went on their own way, their own path, and evolved into these monsters which existed in the Upper Jurassic. So, you know, there's a lineage of where they've come from, which is, you know, now much more documented than ever before. And with scanning technology now, more and more information can be gathered.
If you think about it worldwide, how many pliosaur skulls we've got, there's probably, you know, anything really, really good. There's not that much. So it's still a learning curve on these things. So the more fossils we find, the more evidence we can build on that. You've got to find the evidence, you've got to find the facts before you start making those statements.
Something like this, it inspires children, hopefully gets them out looking for fossils, captures their imagination, you know, because they're the future of science and the future of paleontology. And long may people be allowed to collect this stuff, because if it's not collected, it's eroded, it's gone. When you look back, it was incredible. It was incredible, and, you know, what a thing to be involved in.
This is something that I'll probably never get involved with again ever in my life. So yeah, it's quite humbling in a way when you look back what you see and what you find.
It's hard to believe that giant marine predator has been hiding in a cliff face on the English coast. Just think how many more incredible fossils are just waiting to be discovered. With so much science expanding our knowledge of dinosaurs all the time, it's hard for pop culture to keep up. So it's no surprise that the depictions in movies keep lagging behind. But does it matter? Earlier in this marathon, paleontologist Dave Hone took us through the latest evidence and what it says about how these animals looked and moved. We asked Dave to sit down and watch some of the most famous dinosaur scenes in cinema history and rate their accuracy. What did they get right? Which parts were invented? And what do paleontologists really think about the gap between Hollywood and science?
Hi, my name's Dr. Dave Hone. I'm a paleontologist at Queen Mary University of London. I'm an expert in dinosaurs and pterosaurs, and today I'm going to rate some dinosaurs in TV and film. This is The Lost World from 1925, based on Arthur Conan Doyle's famous book. I think it's a really interesting piece of dinosaur history. There's things in the film that are not in the book, so things like Triceratops is shown here, which hadn't been discovered at the time that the book was written, which is probably why it didn't feature. Though it's an early restoration of it with a kind of extra spiky frill and not very big horns over the eyes, and actually some really nice interactions going on. We've got the adult Triceratops kind of guarding its baby. This would have been really advanced thinking of this time. People are thinking of dinosaurs as basically just big lizards. The complexities of lizard behavior wasn't well understood at that time. So seeing them with these very mammal-like or bird-like behaviors is really quite unusual, and so it's really interesting to see. And of course, this is also still relatively early days of stop-motion animation, and yet the quality of this is absolutely outstanding. The animals move very well, and that in itself is interesting. The fact that they're relatively quick and moving and, you know, jumping around and throwing these bodies about, implies animals that are much more agile and lithe than I think they're often given credit for at the time. So it's really quite a forward-thinking piece of film in that regard.
Hey, look at that. Get quiet, he doesn't see us.
This is King Kong, the 1933 original, which has quite a lot of dinosaurs and other prehistoric animals in it, in addition to Kong itself. For me, I think the most interesting one is the Stegosaurus, a relatively new animal at this time, relatively new discovery, and in the grand scheme of things, it's really quite a good model. It's very big. Stegosaurus did not get that kind of size, but overall it's quite good. We now know they had a rather longer neck. It would have been a bit less bulky overall, and the really famous thing here, which was scientifically accurate to the time, is that it's got 4 rows of tail spikes, where we now know that that's 2 rows. But this is what was going around in the scientific literature at the time, and so actually this model is clearly based on a bunch of illustrations that were done in scientific papers of the time. And this is the famous Tyrannosaurus from King Kong. It's pretty good. It's got 3 fingers on the hands. Tyrannosaurus famously only has 2, but the arms are very, very small. The animal is really nice and big and bulky and robust, which Tyrannosaurus is, compared to pretty much all of the other carnivorous dinosaurs, and certainly the ones that were known at the time. It's got a very upright posture. We often call this a kangaroo posture. The head's really up, the tail's down and dragging along the ground. But actually it's quite agile, it's moving around, it's quite quick, it's jumping about. It's not some very slow, staid, can barely move, it needs the sun kind of interpretation of reptiles, which again was very common for dinosaurs at this time. Perhaps because that doesn't make for a very good monster if it can't run and can't chase things. But mostly this is a pretty good model for something that's nearly 100 years old and made at a time when Tyrannosaurus had only been known for a couple of decades. This is 1 million years BC from 1966, made by the legendary Ray Harryhausen, who actually trained under Wills O'Brien, who did King Kong. So you can see some of the parallels coming out here already. This is the really famous fight scene between the Triceratops and Ceratosaurus. You can find them both in the USA, though they'd been separated by about 100 million years in reality, so they probably wouldn't have come into conflict with one another. The Triceratops is a bit kind of chunky and solid, but the details of the horns, the details of the frill, the skin and the scale texture, the shape of the beak, these are all really, really good, and indeed the position and posture of the feet. The Ceratosaurus, not quite as good. Ceratosaurus was rather smaller than shown here. It wouldn't tower over a Triceratops like that. And the big horn in the middle of the nose, here it's shown to be more like a rhino horn, where actually it's a kind of thin, flat plate, almost like the palm of your hand sticking up on the middle of the nose. And you can see the big row of spikes running along the back. Ceratosaurus was very odd. It's a carnivorous dinosaur, but it actually had some bony armor in its back. So although huge numbers of dinosaurs are illustrated with this lovely big zigzag row of spikes along the back, Ceratosaurus is one of the few where it should genuinely have that. But otherwise this is pretty good. So this is the pterosaur scene from 1 million years BC. Pterosaurs are not dinosaurs, nor are they the ancestors of birds. They're their own group of extinct flying reptiles that lived alongside the dinosaurs. This is supposed to be a pteranodon swooping in to attack. This is about the size and scale of Pteranodon. They get to 7-8 meters in wingspan, so very, very large animals indeed. The 2 big problems you have here is, one, the feet. Pterosaur feet are actually built just like ours, so they'd actually be really terrible at gripping something like a human on the shoulders and flying off with them. We really wouldn't be able to do that. And the other one is the wings. Pterosaur wings were supported by just a single finger, but these ones are shown rather more like bats, with a bunch of bones splaying out all together and then a membrane joining between them. But I did read an interview with Harryhausen once where he said he did it because he thought it looked better, which is a bit of a surprise because I think his models are generally very accurate indeed. But other than that, I really like them, and they're actually still a lot better than most of the pterosaur models you see in these kinds of movies. So yeah, I'm always quite happy with this one. So this is the low-budget sci-fi movie called Planet of Dinosaurs. This is completely unknown, I think, outside a lot of dinosaur nerd circles, and it's a shame because a lot of the animation is absolutely top-notch, and a lot of the models are very good. The T-Rex I really like in this. I mean, it's got these kind of giant crocodile-like scales, which probably wasn't that accurate, and the head could do with being a little bit bigger and a little bit more solid. But as a T-Rex model, before you get to something like Jurassic Park, this is probably the most accurate one that I've seen on screen. Certainly in the era of stop motion animation, it's a really, really good one. And there's a really nice Gallimimus. Gallimimus kind of made famous by Jurassic Park, 20 years later, and yet it's turning up in this film. And it was probably a very difficult animal to model because it's so thin and spindly and moving so quickly. So many of these films just rely on T-Rex, Allosaurus, Triceratops, Stegosaurus, Diplodocus. And so getting in these different animals is really, really nice to see. So this is Prehistoric Beast from 1985. This was a short movie made by Phil Tippett, who would go on to do the RoboCop movies and then actually worked quite a lot on the first Jurassic Park film as a consultant. It's a short film that he made of the end Cretaceous period, and you've basically got a Tyrannosaurus hunting and trying to kill a Centrosaurus. So we've got a nice different ceratopsian this time. We're not doing Triceratops or Styracosaurus yet again. So the single big nose horn. Again, the body proportions are about right for the time. Again, I'd make them a little bit slimmer these days, but the Tyrannosaurus model is really, really good and very nice indeed. It's shot as if these animals were real. So you haven't got humans, you haven't got spaceships, you haven't got any of that other stuff going on. It's just the real environment. And again, it's really quite accurate. He's got the right kind of trees. We've got early flowers at this point. It may look slightly anachronistic, but actually it's accurate to have had these early flowering plants around at this time, and these animals were probably eating that kind of forage. So this is just a really nicely put together, basically kind of extended scene of what life was like in the Cretaceous. And I still think it stands up very well today, despite being now nearly 40 years old. This is not quite Jurassic Park 1993. This is the stop motion test footage that was done for the kitchen scene with the Velociraptors. And this was done by Phil Tippett, who did Prehistoric Beast, before they decided to switch to computer generated imagery. And you can see, if you know the film quite well, this is basically a shot for shot remake of this footage that he put together with them. There's some really nice little details in this. You see the tongue flicker that was put in. This is something that's described by Michael Crichton that the Velociraptors are doing, but that's a very lizard-like action. Dinosaurs did not have lizard-like tongues, and they wouldn't have been doing that, and this was taken out in the later film. But it's got ultimately the same problems that I'd say the Jurassic Park Velociraptors have. They're way too big. Velociraptor is a fraction of this size, and even at the time we were pretty suspicious that they likely had feathers. And of course now it's been completely confirmed. So these animals would have been totally covered in very bird-like feathers, but I think this is a really nice little bit of history where you're just seeing the transition from stop motion then ultimately replaced by computer effects in this film. Jurassic Park 3, 2001, so you've really got the transformation at this point. Now you really see that we're in full CG mode. You can generate huge numbers of dinosaurs, they can interact with the environment, they can interact with the people, and it's a totally different form of filmmaking, really. But the dinosaurs themselves are mostly very nice. I've said before, and I'm happy to say again, I think Jurassic Park 3 is probably the best of the whole series. It's certainly got the most dinosaurs in it, and I think it has a lot of the best dinosaurs in it. The Spinosaurus is certainly dated now, but at the time it was quite a good model. Spinosaurus was a very poorly known animal. We knew very little of its anatomy beyond the nose at the big size and the big sail down the back and large arms. The pteranodons are mostly very, very good. The babies I'm less fond of, but the adults are absolutely superb. They're the right size, they're the right shape, they've got the giant single wing membrane with the giant finger. The animals are walking around on all fours. The way they jump off and fly and turn around is really, really good. So as a pterosaur fan, I'm very pleased with Jurassic Park 3 pterosaurs.
Filmmakers are naturally tempted to take liberties with the way they depict prehistoric animals, but that's not always how it works. One TV series went to great lengths to create some of the most accurate depictions of dinosaurs we've ever seen, drawing on paleontologists' latest ideas about what dinosaurs actually look like and how they behaved.
This is prehistoric puppet.
Puppet for us to move, and animators move the puppet around.
It's honestly a lot like
playing with toys, like just like when you're a kid, just like, rah, it's gonna go over here. Like, it feels like that. So this is a scene from the desert bloom sequence with Mononicus. It's a very highly specialized dinosaur. We know that it lived in the desert and likes to hunt insects. And it has these little stubby little claws, and with claws that are like about 7.5 centimeters long. They're similar to like a pangolin or like an anteater, where they will use them to dig into a termite mound. We really just try and filter in what we can see from birds into this. I came across a golden pheasant, which was very spurty, it would run quickly and then stop and then cock its head and then run again. And so I felt like, this kind of felt like this very long-legged dinosaur with these strange head gestures. So I really wanted to push that character for this dinosaur. So here's the scene where we've got the log brought in along with the Mononicus. And so I will be grabbing these controls and moving this guy along, grabbing the foot and taking a step or doing a jump. And we would refine this and show this to Dr. Darren Naish to see if we're following the science. Does this make sense for the anatomical structure of a Mononicus? Once we've gotten the animation to a point that we're happy with, then we send it to lighting department and the groom department, and they'll light the scene. Fur gets put on the dinosaur, and they will, compositing will make that dinosaur fit in the environment.
They are extraordinary animals with individual lives and struggles which apply in the way that they apply today. And so, the universality of the struggles of animals is a story that can be told irrespective of whether you're telling it today or telling it 65 million years ago.
It was an incredibly rich and diverse time with multiple different environments, multiple different habitats, multiple different groups of animals doing really cool things.
Dinosaurs disappeared from our planet 66 million years ago, yet they've been capturing our imaginations since we first started digging up their fossils. We can never truly know what they were like, but paleontologists are gradually giving us a more accurate picture, refining the fanciful images that we've all grown up with. What we've learned in this marathon is that science is richer than fiction, stranger, more contested, more alive, and still in progress. The Jurassic coast is still giving up new species. The Spinosaurus is still being argued about. There are thousands of fossils in the ground that nobody's looked at yet. The story of dinosaurs is not over. We're somewhere in the middle of it. Thank you for staying. If this has changed how you think about the animals that came before us, please subscribe and let us know in the comments which dinosaur fact surprised you most. If you want to keep going, we have another marathon on our own evolutionary story. Why are we the only human species left standing, and what happened to everyone else? See you next time.